I only needed shelter. But something beneath that mountain had been waiting for me.
She was 20 and cold. No room. No key. No person waiting. Just a canvas satchel and $3 she had kept folded behind the photograph in her cracked bus station Bible. And with that $3, she bought a miniature railroad depot, forgotten outside Strasburg in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a place the township stopped marking on property sheets in 1997. Rain came through a seam in the tar paper roof. The south wall leaned 2 inches toward the weeds. The county had said the building had been closed since 1998 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the plaster mountain of the largest model railroad table, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 57 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Faye Whitcomb had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited first in rooms that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet, where grown people spoke over her head as though a child were a chair, useful when needed and moved aside when guests came. She had waited beside school office doors with her backpack on both knees, while women with lanyards searched folders and used the careful voices adults reserve for children whose lives have already become paperwork. She had waited at kitchen tables where supper was served according to favor, and she learned before she could divide fractions that hunger had a social order. Her first memories did not arrive as stories. They came as textures. A wool blanket with a satin edge worn down to threads, a radiator clicking at night in a county apartment near Coatesville, the smell of powdered laundry soap in a plastic bin where her few shirts were kept separate from everybody else's, a woman's hand, not cruel in motion but never lingering, buttoning Faye into a coat too thin for February and telling her to stand straight, because people noticed posture before they noticed need. Faye did stand straight. She learned to make herself narrow in hallways and useful in kitchens. She learned the names of tools faster than the names of neighbors because tools kept their promises. A screwdriver turned a screw, a needle carried thread, a brush, if cleaned properly and hung bristles down, would be ready the next morning without complaint. People were not so exact. The house where she spent most of her childhood belonged to Lorraine Pike, her foster mother, though Lorraine never used the second word unless a caseworker was standing in the living room with a clipboard. To the county, Lorraine was steady, experienced, willing to take older placements nobody else wanted. To the church ladies who delivered canned peaches in December, she was long-suffering. She had a square face, small gold hoops in both ears, and a habit of tightening her mouth before she answered a question, as if every sentence cost her money. She kept plastic covers on the good chairs and rules taped to the refrigerator. Faye washed dishes on a stool when she was 7, folded towels by colour at 8, and by 10 could clean a bathroom mirror without leaving a streak. Lorraine said this made her fortunate. Work, she would say, was a kindness given early. She said it while standing in the doorway counting towels, counting cans, counting how much cereal remained in the box. There was a man in that house for a while, a quiet man named Darryl, who drove a delivery route and came home smelling of diesel, cigarettes and cold rain trapped in canvas. He was not Faye's father, he did not pretend to be. On days when Lorraine's voice sharpened, Darryl would take a plate to the porch and eat there, looking out toward the alley where weeds came through the cracked pavement. Once when Faye dropped a mug and stood waiting for punishment, he bent with a dustpan and said only, "Porcelain breaks loud, that's all." He disappeared from the house when Faye was 12. Lorraine put his boots in a garbage bag before breakfast and scrubbed the ring his shaving cream had left on the bathroom sink. No one explained. Faye did not ask. By then, she had learned that questions were hooks. If you put one out, someone might pull hard enough to tear the line. The only reliable mercy in those years arrived on Saturdays. Not every Saturday. Not in winter storms. Not when Lorraine said gas was too high. Not when a caseworker had asked too many questions. but often enough for the memory to become a room inside Faye, furnished in maple light and the smell of pine shavings. Her great-uncle Walter Whitcomb lived in a rented half-house behind a feed store outside Quarryville, where the windows rattled when trucks passed, and the kitchen linoleum had faded into pale squares. Walter was her mother's uncle by blood, though no one in Lorraine's house liked mentioning that Faye had blood anywhere. He was a narrow man with large hands, white hair combed back with water, and blue veins raised along his wrists like pencil lines under paper. He walked with a cane after the mill accident, but his hands never shook when the work was delicate. Walter built miniature worlds, not toys. He corrected that once, gently, and never had to correct it again. He made dioramas of vanished Pennsylvania crossings, coal trestles, switch towers, milk platforms, stone culverts, and stations where no passenger train had stopped for 40 years. He carved fence posts from pear wood, laid gravel with a spoon, painted rust onto freight car couplers with a brush that held 2 hairs, and threaded copper wire through plaster hills so that a farmhouse window could glow at dusk. His worktable was a door laid across 2 filing cabinets. Above it hung jars of labelled powder, burnt umber, cinder dust, sifted shale, meadow blend, winter ballast, ash grey. He made trees from twisted wire, dipped in matte at medium, and rolled in ground foam, and he kept a little notebook of formulas written in careful block letters. 2 parts plaster, 1 part sifted paper pulp, a pinch of dry pigment before water. Never hurry the cure. Faye's weekend ritual began with sweeping his workroom, because Walter said dust had character and should be moved only after you understood which kind it was. Sawdust belonged near cutting, plaster dust belonged nowhere. Graphite dust, from the old pencils he used for weathering, could soften a roofline if you gathered it on the side of your finger and knew how lightly to touch. At noon they ate tomato soup from chipped bowls, and Walter let her toast bread directly on the gas flame with tongs. In the afternoon he taught her patient labour. He showed her how to score foam board without cutting through the backing, how to solder 2 wires without burning the insulation, how to drill a hole fine enough for a lamppost and wide enough that the brass tube would not split the platform. He taught her to listen to material. Basswood complained before it cracked, plaster cooled as it set, tin plate flexed twice, then remembered the bend forever. By the time she was 14, she could make a brick wall from cardstock, paint each brick in a slightly altered red, press mortar lines with the dull back of a blade, and add weather marks beneath a window where rain would have carried soot downward over years. Walter never praised quickly. He would turn her work under the lamp, adjust his glasses, and nod after a long silence. His nod gave more warmth than most people's embraces. On her 15th birthday, he took a shoebox from the top shelf of his closet and set it before her with both hands. Inside lay 3 tools wrapped in flannel, a pin vise, a jeweller's file, and a pair of tweezers so fine they met without daylight between the tips. These do not make the hand careful, he told her. They reveal whether it already is. Faye remembered that sentence because he did not say it like a compliment. He said it like a measurement. Over time she came to understand that carefulness was not fear of error. It was respect for what was smaller than you, weaker than you, and easily ruined by impatience. A careful hand did not mean a frightened hand. It meant an honest one. That was Walter's gift. Not the tools alone, though. She loved them. Not the skill alone, though it gave her private shelter. He taught her that scale could be merciful. A child who had no command over rooms, money, locks, signatures, or adults could still make a whole station platform fit beneath one lamp. She could place a bench where someone weary might sit. She could put a light inside a window and decide that, in this one narrow world, nobody would be turned away from the door. Walter's decline came in the autumn she was 16, when the sycamores along the road dropped leaves spotted brown as old paper. At first he blamed the damp, then the accident in the mill, then age with a wry lift of the eyebrow, as though age were a neighbour borrowing too many tools. His cough deepened, his hands grew light. One Saturday Faye arrived to find the workroom swept too clean, and his chair moved near the window where he could sit without crossing the floor. He still made her work. "Lay the track," he said. Pointing with 2 fingers, she laid it. Not by hope, by gauge. She took it up and laid it again. In November, Lorraine said there would be no more Saturday drives. Gas had gone up, Walter was not close family, Faye had chores, the reasons changed, which made them harder to argue with. She wrote Walter letters on notebook paper describing school weather and a tiny freight office she was building from a cereal box. She never knew whether he received them. He died on the 6th day of March, during a wet snow that turned the roads silver and dangerous. No one took Faye to the burial. Lorraine said there had been confusion. She said the call came too late. She said grief did not excuse laundry. 3 weeks later, a cardboard box arrived at the Pike house with Walter's name written in black marker on the side. Faye saw it once on the kitchen table while Lorraine cut the tape with a steak knife. Inside were envelopes, a wool cap, papers, photographs, and a biscuit tin Faye recognized at once because Walter had kept his brass lamps in it. Lorraine lifted each thing with 2 fingers, as though the dead had left dust on purpose. Faye was sent to scrub the back steps. When she came in, the box was gone. She found the wool cap later in the rag bin, cut across the crown. The biscuit tin never appeared again. Neither did the 3 tools in flannel, which Faye had kept under her mattress until Lorraine did a room inspection while Faye was at school. The pin vise, the jeweller's file, and the fine tweezers vanished with no explanation. That was the year Faye stopped asking where things went. Lorraine's cruelty was not theatrical. It did not break plates or raise hands where marks would show. It worked like dampness entering corners, swelling wood, making doors hard to open. She knew the value of records, appearances, and timing. She smiled for officials. She kept school photos in frames until the stipend ended. She bought Faye a birthday cupcake in front of the youth pastor, and later ate half of it standing at the sink because, she said, sweets spoiled if left out. Her house ran on withheld permissions. Permission to use the washing machine. Permission to attend an after-school club. Permission to call the one girl who had once invited Faye to a sleepover. Lorraine could make a delay feel like law. Tomorrow, she would say. Then tomorrow would become next week, and next week would become never, and never would sit in the room with them as calmly as a guest. After Walter's death, Faye took refuge in invisible work. She repaired broken drawer pulls. She rehemmed Lorraine's curtains. She rewired a thrift store lamp with a library book open beside her, fingers moving slowly, deliberate as prayer. In school, she spent lunch in the art room with a teacher who let her use scraps of matboard. She made little storefronts, little porch steps, little rain barrels, each one more exact than the life around her. She did not call this hope. Hope required a future large enough to stand in. Faye's future had been discussed by other people in narrow rooms, under fluorescent lights, in the language of eligibility and transition planning. She would age out, she would need employment, she would need housing assistance, she would need to be realistic. Realistic was a word adults used when they had already decided how little you deserved. On the morning of her 18th birthday, rain moved across the windows in thin diagonal lines. The house smelled of scorched coffee and lemon cleaner. Faye came downstairs wearing the grey sweater she had mended twice at the cuff, carrying a folder of papers from school, a list of community college forms, a number for a shelter in Lancaster, a half-page printout about apprenticeships she had found and folded into quarters. Lorraine stood by the back door in her house shoes, hair pinned up, robe tied with a knot too tight. A black trash bag rested on the step beside her, through the clear stretch near the top. Faye could see the sleeve of her blue shirt, the spine of her sketchbook, and one brown shoe pressed sideways against the plastic. For a moment, Faye looked at the bag with the careful attention Walter had taught her to give a fragile thing. She noticed the yellow drawstring, the bead of rain already forming on the knot, the way the plastic sagged where books made it heavy. Lorraine held out a white envelope. Inside were Faye's birth certificate copy, her social security card, an expired bus pass, and 3 crumpled $1 bills. The kitchen clock clicked once. Lorraine said, "You're 18. The state stops paying today." 8 words. Not shouted. Not even sharpened. Faye looked past her, toward the dining room where Lorraine's sister sat with both hands around a mug. That woman had once told a caseworker that Faye was quiet as a blessing. Now she stared into her coffee, lips pressed flat, offering the kind of silence that lets harm finish its sentence. The deadbolt had already been turned behind Faye's coat hanging on its peg. Her toothbrush was not in the downstairs bathroom. Her school papers had been placed on top of the trash bag, already damp at the edges. Lorraine opened the storm door and set the bag outside with the toe of one slipper. Faye did not plead, not because she was brave. Bravery would have required a witness. She bent, gathered the bag, tucked the envelope inside her sweater, and stepped into the rain. Behind her, the door closed with a clean domestic click. For the first hour, she stood beneath the narrow awning of the garage, not because she expected the door to open, but because the body sometimes needs time to learn what the mind already knows. Rain collected at the hem of her jeans. A school bus passed, yellow and loud. The driver did not look toward the house. By noon she was walking along the shoulder with the trash bag over one shoulder and the folder tucked against her ribs. Her first destination was the public library, because libraries did not ask why your hands were red from cold if you knew how to be quiet. She sat in a corner near the local history shelves and sorted her belongings into what could be carried and what had to be left. 2 shirts, 1 sweater, 1 skirt, 1 pair of jeans, a comb, a cracked Bible from Walter's kitchen shelf, given to her the year before he died because the back pages were blank enough for notes. A photograph of Walter standing beside a model crossing gate. His head turned away as if someone had called him. She folded the $3 into the photograph and placed both behind the Bible's last page. That night she slept at the Lancaster bus station, sitting upright in the corner where the vending machines hummed. A security guard with a silver mustache woke her at 2 in the morning and told her she could not sleep there. His voice was tired, not cruel. When she stood, he looked at the trash bag and softened around the eyes. "Wait till 5, he said. Then move." She waited till 5. The 6 weeks that followed did not pass like ordinary time. They passed by surfaces. A vinyl bench in Lancaster that stuck to her cheek. A church basement cot in York with a grey blanket labelled Property of County Emergency Management. A storage alcove behind the Harrisburg Transit Center where she slept sitting against a soda machine until a janitor found her and looked away long enough for her to gather her bag. A women's shelter in Reading where every bed was full by 4 in the afternoon. And a volunteer gave her 2 peanut butter crackers in a napkin without recording it. A laundromat in Columbia where she spent 75 cents on a dryer she did not use, just so she could sit near the heat and pretend the tumbling belonged to her. She learned which convenience stores let a person use the restroom after buying nothing. She learned that coffee refills were cheaper than first cups if you kept the paper cup and wiped the rim. She learned to carry a library card application even without an address, because a clipboard made her look as though she belonged somewhere official. The money diminished in coins, not dollars, a bus fare to York, a cup of soup in Harrisburg after a day when her hands shook too hard to thread a needle, a thrift store scarf from a bin outside a church shop, because the wind had found the gap between her collar and neck and stayed there like a hand. Once in Lancaster she stood outside a hobby shop window and watched a man arrange model train cars in a display case. There was a Pennsylvania Railroad caboose the size of her thumb, painted Tuscan red with tiny ladders at both ends. She stayed until the man inside noticed her and turned the sign from open to closed, though it was only 4:10. She walked away without blame. Blame took strength at night, when the noise around her settled into the coughs, wheels, engines, doors, and far-off sirens of other people's destinations. She opened Walter's Bible and read the blank back pages where she had copied his formulas from memory. She had written them small to save space. India ink, thin with distilled water. Von drop gum Arabic. Rust wash, burnt sienna, black. Touch of green. Grass near track never bright. Dust remembers iron. She could still hear his voice in the last line. Dust remembers iron. He had said it while brushing pigment along a rail bed, explaining that nothing close to a railroad stayed clean for long. Even the grass carried the work. By the 5th week, Faye had stopped counting days and started counting places she could be between closing hours. Mornings belonged to libraries because libraries opened their doors to silence. Afternoons belonged to streets with bench. Evenings belonged to bus stations until someone told her to move. Nights were negotiations with weather. She never called Lorraine. She never walked back to that house. The address existed in her mind only as a place where a door had made a sound. The classified ad appeared on a Tuesday in the basement reading room of the Lancaster Public Library. In a stack of county notices and auction sheets no one had bothered to straighten. Faye had gone there because her socks were wet and because the library had a radiator beneath the microfilm cabinet that gave off steady heat if you sat on the floor and pretended to study the lower drawers. The paper was folded wrong, hiding the real estate section inside legal notices. A line of type caught her attention because of the word miniature. County disposal sale. Abandoned commercial structure. Former miniature railroad depot and diorama workshop. Parcel. Outside. Strasburg. Borough. UN safe entry. NO utilities. BUIY assumes all risk. Minimum bid. $3. She read it once. Then again. Slowly. There was a number at the bottom for the Lancaster County Clerk's office, and beside it the date of the final filing. The sale had received no bids. The demolition order had been posted. Any remaining contents were included with the structure, provided the buyer signed a waiver and paid recording fees already absorbed by the county under nuisance disposal. Faye held the paper so carefully the edge did not tremble. Former miniature railroad depot and diorama workshop. The words opened a door she had not known was still inside her. She pictured Walter's jars of powder, the pin vise, the lamp glowing over the table, a plaster hill drying in the window while rain moved down the glass. She pictured, with no permission from reason, a room where small things had been kept, not thrown away. The clerk at the reference desk let her use the phone after Faye showed the notice, and asked in a voice made formal by fear. She wrote the address on the margin of the newspaper. She wrote the bus route. She wrote the name of the office. Her remaining money was still behind Walter's photograph, softened at the folds, waiting in the cracked Bible like 3 pressed leaves. That evening, she went to the bus station and studied the schedule until the numbers settled. She could not afford the full ride. She could take one bus partway, walk the rest, and maybe sleep in a hay barn if she reached farm country after dark. She had half a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a napkin, a pencil worn short, and the trash bag replaced by a canvas satchel a shelter volunteer had given her when the plastic split open on Queen Street. The satchel had one broken strap. She repaired it with dental floss in the women's restroom, pulling each stitch tight and knotting twice. Before dawn, Faye stood outside the station while the sky over Lancaster turned the colour of tin. The Bible rested at the bottom of her bag. The $3 remained folded behind Walter's photograph. Her hands were cold enough that the coins in her pocket felt warmer than her skin. When the first bus sighed open at the curb, she climbed aboard and paid only as far as she could. By noon, the city would be behind her. By evening, if her feet held, she would be walking toward Strasburg, toward a condemned building with rain in its roof, a leaning wall, and a room full of patient, forgotten worlds no one had thought worth saving. The bus let her down where the road widened beside a winter-bare field, and the driver did not wait for her to decide whether she had made a mistake. The door folded shut with a rubber sigh. The engine pulled away toward the east, taking with it the last pocket of warm air she had stood near since morning. She watched the red lights shrink past a line of black locust trees, then adjusted the canvas satchel against her shoulder and began walking. The day had no kindness in it, but it was not cruel either. It was simply late November in Lancaster County, with a sky the colour of unwashed wool and fields lying open on both sides of the road. Cornstalks had been cut to pale stubble. A few remained broken near the ditches, rattling in the wind like dry paper. Far off, a farmhouse chimney sent up a level ribbon of smoke that flattened before it rose. She had come as far as the bus fare allowed. The rest belonged to her feet. At first she counted telephone poles, then fence posts, then breaths. Counting helped when distance tried to become thought. She kept to the shoulder where gravel had been pressed into the mud, stepping aside whenever a pickup passed. Twice, drivers slowed as if to offer help, then continued without lowering a window. She did not blame them. A young woman on a rural road with a canvas satchel and no proper coat was a question most people did not want to answer. Near dusk, after 7 miles that felt longer because hunger had made her light-headed, she found the hay barn. It stood back from the road beyond a rusted gate, its siding silvered by years of weather, and one door hanging enough open for a body to pass through. She stood at the fence line for a long while before crossing. She watched the farmhouse beyond it. No dog barked. No porch light turned toward her. The barn had been emptied of livestock, but there was loose hay along one wall and a smell of dust, dry grass, and old rope. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees before midnight. She knew because a cracked thermometer was nailed beside the tackroom door. The red line falling with patient certainty. She burrowed beneath the hay, coat pulled over her chest, satchel tied once around her wrist so no one could take it while she slept. Mice moved in the wall, wind entered through seams and found her ears, her hands, the tender place under her jaw. She slept in pieces. Before dawn she woke with hay in her hair and numbness in her toes. She stamped her feet until feeling returned in painful pins. Outside the fields were pale with frost, every cut stalk edged in white. A horse and buggy passed on the road, wheels clicking, the horse's breath rising in slow clouds. The driver did not turn his head. Though perhaps he saw her, in that country, people could be merciful by not asking. She walked again. By mid-morning, the land had begun changing around her, not in drama but in arrangement. More houses stood close to the road. Barns grew larger, their stone foundations squared and true. Split rail fences gave way to white board fences, and signs appeared for quilts, harness repair, roadside eggs, shoofly pie, buggy rides. A flock of starlings lifted from a field all at once, turned like a dark cloth in the air, then settled again beyond a line of walnut trees. The first sound of the railroad reached her before the town did. It was not the clean whistle of childhood stories, but a deep, working note that rolled across the fields, softened by distance and damp air. She stopped walking when she heard it. The sound seemed to come through the ground as much as the sky, through the gravel under her soles, through the bones in her ankles. A long breath of steam followed. Somewhere ahead, a locomotive was moving. Not in memory, not in a model, but under its own iron weight. She stood still until the sound faded. Then she went on. Strasburg came into view without announcement. A church steeple, brick houses with green shutters, narrow porches, trimmed hedges. The kind of town that seemed to have kept its face washed for visitors, even in cold weather. She entered along West Main Street, with her satchel tucked against her hip, passing places whose windows held more warmth than she had known in weeks. There was Speckled Hen Coffee, where people leaned over cups beneath hanging lights, and a chalkboard menu offered soups she could smell from the sidewalk. There was the Strasburg Country Store and Creamery, bright with jars, candy, and painted signs, its windows fogged at the edges by heat inside. There was Fireside Tavern, with dark wood trim and a brass handle polished by many hands. Farther along stood Village Green's miniature golf, closed for the season, its little windmill still and dusted with frost. A sign for the Strasburg Railroad pointed toward tracks and museum grounds beyond town, where a faint coal smell rested in the air like something remembered by the whole place. She paused outside the creamery window because there was a display of small glass bottles of milk and a tray of cinnamon rolls under a covered dome. Her stomach tightened sharply, then settled. Looking did not cost anything, unless she stayed too long. At the county clerk's office in Lancaster, she had been told by phone that the paperwork could be prepared at a municipal desk in Strasburg for abandoned nuisance parcels transferred under county authority. It had sounded complicated on the telephone, and it sounded less believable now that she stood in front of the brick building with a flag hanging at half-twist from its pole and a wreath already wired to the door. Inside, the heat made her eyes sting. The front room smelled of paper, floor wax, and a faint mineral odour from wet boots drying on a mat. There were framed maps on the wall, a rack of forms, 2 wooden chairs, and a counter with a bell placed exactly in the centre. Behind the counter, file cabinets stood in patient rows. A clock ticked loudly, as if making sure every person who entered knew that public time was different from private need. She wiped her shoes twice before stepping farther in. A woman sat at the main desk, writing with a blue pen in a ledger so large it seemed to belong to an older century. Her hair was the colour of pewter, cut in a blunt line at her chin. She wore a brown cardigan over a white blouse, and reading glasses hung from a black cord against her chest. Her face had the composed severity of someone who had seen many people come in with urgent stories, and had learned to listen first to documents. The nameplate on her desk read MRS. Elaine Hirschberger. Clerk. She looked up. Yes. Not a question. Not unkind. The girl stepped to the counter and placed the folded notice on the wood. She had carried it so long the creases had softened. I called yesterday about the abandoned depot parcel. Mrs. Hirschberger took the notice, unfolded it, and read as though she had not already known every line. Her eyes moved over the print once, then again. Slower. You are the bidder. Yes. Ma'am. The only bidder. Yes. Ma'am. The clerk looked over the top of her glasses. How old are you? 20. That answer seemed to land somewhere between them and remain standing. Mrs. Hirschberger set the paper down and opened a drawer. She removed a folder tied with cotton tape, loosened the bow and spread several pages across the desk. The top page contained a parcel map with a red outline around a narrow rectangle of land, shaded by hand. Beside it were typed descriptions, county stamps, old tax numbers, and one photograph printed in grainy black and white. It showed a long, low building half hidden by sumac and wild grapevine. The clerk tapped the photograph with one finger. You understand this is not a dwelling. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no running water. Yes. Ma'am. No heat. Yes. Ma'am. No electric service connected. Yes. Ma'am. The roof is compromised, and the county inspector noted possible structural failure along the south wall. Yes. Ma'am. You understand that by signing this, you accept responsibility for injury, contents, vermin, weather damage, disposal, back fees, and any code work before occupancy. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Hirschberger inhaled through her nose and folded her hands on the desk. Child. Saying yes does not make a rotten board hold. The words were plain enough to be useful. The girl accepted them without lowering her eyes. No, ma'am. I know. There is no promise of anything inside worth keeping. I know. There is a demolition hold until spring because the contractor schedule is full. That is the only reason it is still standing. Yes. Ma'am. If you sign, the county will not come repair it. The township will not bring water. The Railroad Museum has already declined contents. Salvage companies declined because of access and mould. 2 hobby clubs looked at the inventory in 2011 and did not return. The girl's fingers rested on the counter edge, red at the knuckles. "May I still sign?" For the first time, the clerk's expression altered. Not softened exactly. Narrowed, perhaps with a kind of attention that did not fit neatly into pity. "You have the purchase amount." The girl opened the Bible and took out the folded bills from behind the photograph. She smoothed them on the counter, one by one. They were worn and limp, the corners furred by other hands. Mrs. Hirschberger looked at them, then at the Bible, then at the photograph visible for one brief moment before it was covered again. Something in her gaze paused. "What is your surname?" the girl answered quietly. The clerk did not move for several seconds. The clock behind her kept ticking. Outside. A truck passed, tires hissing on damp pavement. "Spell it." She spelled it. Mrs. Hirschberger turned from the counter to the row of file cabinets. Her hand went not to the drawer nearest her, but to one higher and farther left. She pulled it open with a metallic scrape, flipped through hanging folders, and removed a thin yellow sheet clipped to an older index card. Her lips moved once over the writing there. Then she turned back. "There was a man with that name," she said. "He came to county historical meetings years ago. Not many, but enough. He brought models wrapped in towels and corrected our railroad exhibit twice." The girl's hand tightened around the satchel strap. Mrs. Hirschberger studied her face more carefully now. Not with suspicion, but with the discomfort of recognizing a thread no record had asked her to follow. He had a cane. Always wore a brown hat. The girl did not answer at once. If she opened her mouth too quickly, something ungoverned might come through. She nodded once. "He was kin to you." Another nod. The clerk looked down at the yellow sheet. He asked once about the depot. Wanted to know who owned the contents. Said there had been a workshop there before the county took the parcel. That would have been maybe 2009. I told him what records showed. No heirs found. Taxes unpaid. He stood right where you're standing and said, "Somebody careful ought to look before it goes." The room became very still around that sentence. Mrs. Hirschberger put the sheet back in the folder without offering to show it. Public records had their own manners. Then she took the 3 bills, aligned their edges, and slid open a receipt book. "I can accept this," she said. "Fees are waived under disposal authority. You will receive a quitclaim deed. That does not mean clear history. It means the county transfers whatever interest it holds. Yes. Ma'am. You will sign here, here, and initial each warning page." The pen she handed over was heavier than expected. Blue enamel with a silver clip. The girl wrote her name slowly, with care that belonged less to penmanship than to proof of being present. Each letter seemed to cross a bridge from the life where doors were shut to a place not yet formed. The paper took her name. Mrs. Hirschberger turned the pages, marked each place with a square of yellow paper, and waited. She did not rush. She did not comfort. This restraint felt, in its way, generous. After the last signature, the clerk lifted a brass stamp from beside the ledger. It was round, darkened at the handle from years of use, and heavier than the pen had been. She slid the deed beneath it, aligned the seal by touch and pressed down. The stamp struck with a dull official sound. Not loud. Final. She added the date, wrote a receipt in duplicate, tore one copy along the perforation, and placed it with the deed inside a manila envelope. Then she reached into another drawer and withdrew a narrow road map, the kind given to tourists before phones taught people to stop folding paper. "You will leave by East Main," she said, drawing a line with the pen cap. "Past the creamery, then the railroad grounds. Take Paradise Lane north for a stretch. then turned toward White Oak Road. The parcel sits off a gravel spur that does not show properly anymore. There is a rusted milk can at the turn, unless someone finally took it. If you reach the walnut grove and the little stone culvert, you have gone too far by about 200 yards. The girl followed each point with her eyes. Do not enter after dark. She looked up. Mrs. Hirschberger held her gaze. That is not a legal warning. That is an old woman's advice. Yes. Ma'am. The clerk opened the manila envelope once more and placed something inside with the deed. It was the original receipt for the 3 worn bills, stamped and initialed. Then, after a moment that seemed to require a private decision, she took the bills themselves and placed them in the top drawer of her desk rather than the cash envelope. The girl noticed but did not ask. Mrs. Hirschberger saw that she noticed. I will reconcile it from petty cash, the clerk said. Those can stay here a little while. The words were strange. Not charity, exactly. Not refusal. More like a witness being set aside, preserved from the daily machinery of payments. The girl put the envelope in her satchel and turned to leave. At the door, the clerk spoke again. Your great-uncle had steady hands. She stopped with her palm on the brass knob. He did. The clerk nodded once, as though that answer had confirmed something no document could. Then you may know what to save. Outside the afternoon had begun leaning toward evening. The town looked different after the stamp. The same brick walks, same passing cars, same neat windows, but the air around her had altered by one narrow degree. She did not own safety. She did not own comfort. She owned responsibility, and responsibility had weight enough to keep her from floating away. She passed Speckled Hen again and smelled coffee. She passed the country store where a child pressed both palms to the glass to look at jars of candy. She passed a quilting shop with folded fabrics arranged by colour in the window, blues moving into greens, greens into golds, every bolt patient and clean. At the railroad crossing she stopped while gates lowered and a tourist train moved slowly through, black engine breathing steam, red cars following behind like a memory dressed for company. People lifted phones. Children pointed. The girl watched the wheels. Iron on rail. Weight accepted by line. Motion made possible because every narrow distance had been measured and kept. When the train passed, she crossed. The road beyond town became less dressed. Houses stood farther apart. A dog barked from behind a split-rail fence, not with anger but professional concern. It was a brown hound with one white foot, and it followed her along the fence until the boundary ended, then stood at the corner watching her go. Across a field, 2 Amish boys lifted fence rails onto a wagon. One looked toward her, the other did not. A woman in a dark bonnet carried laundry from a line into a white farmhouse, the sheets stiff with cold. The gravel spur was easy to miss because grass had grown into the middle and the sign had fallen face down into weeds. The milk can remained, though rust had eaten one side into lace. She turned there, walking beneath walnut trees whose branches crossed high overhead. Their leaves were gone, leaving the black shapes of limbs against a sky lowering toward dusk. Hulls from the autumn crop had dried and split along the ground, staining the frost-dark leaves. A stone culvert appeared ahead, low and mossed, water moving beneath it with the thin sound of winter runoff. She remembered the clerk's warning and turned back 200 yards. There, half concealed by sumac and a collapsed wire fence, stood the depot. It was longer than the photograph had made it seem. Perhaps 40 feet from end to end, no more than 16 feet deep, built of weathered clapboard over a low fieldstone foundation. The roof was tar paper over older shingles, patched in at least 3 places with tin, and one place with what looked like flattened feed signs. A brick chimney rose near the rear corner, its top course uneven. The south wall had bowed outward enough that the window frames on that side no longer sat square. 2 windows were boarded, one had no glass at all. Vines had entered there and dried in place, their tendrils curled around the sill like fingers. Above the front door hung a sign, hand-painted long ago and nearly unreadable beneath mildew. Miniature depot, landscapes, repairs, custom rail lines. The letters had once been cream over green. Now the green had weathered almost black, and the cream had flaked away in islands. A carved wooden train, small and simple, ran along the bottom of the sign, though one wheel had broken off. She stood before it for a long time, not because it was beautiful, it was not in any ordinary sense. It looked tired in the way abandoned working places look tired, less like they have died than like they have spent themselves on tasks no one remembers. The steps were soft at the edges, the door sagged, the gutter hung loose, one end pointing toward the ground. A hornet nest, empty for the season, clung beneath the eave. Still, the building had proportion. Someone had measured it with care. The front windows were centered around the door. The chimney had been placed where heat could reach both rooms. The threshold was stone, worn in the center by feet that must once have entered carrying lumber, plaster sacks, model boxes, coffee tins of screws, paper bags of wire and paint. She took the key from the envelope. It was not a proper key, but a county padlock key on a paper tag. The county's chain hung through the hasp. Her hands were stiff, and the key resisted twice before turning. The lock opened with a click that seemed too small for what it permitted. She removed the chain. The door stuck against swollen wood. She put one shoulder to it and pushed. At first, nothing moved. Then the bottom edge scraped over the floor inside, and the depot opened 6 inches. 12, enough for cold air to leave and a darker cold to meet her. The smell came first. Dust mouse nests, old paper, dry rot, mildew, and beneath all of it a mineral trace of plaster and solder, so faint it might have been memory rather than scent. She held the door open and waited for her eyes to adjust. The front room was narrow, with a counter along one wall and shelves behind it. Broken glass lay near the window where the vine had entered. A calendar from 1984 hung crooked beside a nail where something heavier had once been. On the counter sat a cash register with no drawer, 3 empty paint racks, and a coffee mug filled with dead flies. The floorboards complained under her first step. She stopped, listened, then shifted her weight more carefully. In the corner stood a rotating display rack for postcards, each slot empty except for one water-curled card showing a steam engine in summer sunlight. A ceiling fixture hung by its wires, shade missing. The wallpaper had separated near the chimney wall and curled downward in dry tongues. She touched nothing at first. Walter had taught her that entering a workshop was not the same as taking possession. You let the room speak by where dust settled, where tools had been put down, where a hand had meant to return. The back room occupied most of the building. When she pushed through the inner door, the hinges gave a long, reluctant note. There, in the failing light from high windows, she saw the tables. Not one table. A country. A railroad landscape filled nearly half the room, raised on timber framing, its edges wrapped in painted fascia dulled by years. Tracks curved through brown fields, over a trestle past a station, into a tunnel beneath a plaster mountain that rose almost to her shoulder. The mountain had been painted with shale greys and wintergreens. Dust softened it. Spiderwebs hung from its ridges to the ceiling joists. A miniature river, made from resin darkened amber with age, ran under a bridge no longer straight. Beyond the large table were smaller workbenches, racks of stripwood, drawers labelled switch parts, figures, decals, brass tube, resistors, a magnifying lamp bent over a chair as if still attending someone's hand. On one wall, pegboard held outlines where tools had hung, each absence shaped more clearly than the wood around it. A spool of red wire had fallen and rolled beneath the bench, trailing a line across the floor. The roof seam had leaked near the far corner, and a black stain ran down the wall. In that corner, plaster hills on a second diorama had sagged, pulling little trees sideways. A miniature church steeple lay on its side in a field of dust. One tiny painted woman stood alone on a platform, still waiting for a train that would never arrive unless someone repaired the current. The girl moved toward the large layout with her breath held. Close up, the workmanship was uneven in places, tender in others. Some tree trunks were clumsy, twisted too thick. Some rocks were painted flat, but the station platforms were exact. The gravel changed colour near the rails. The weeds grew taller where a fence had fallen. Someone had known how weather behaved. Someone had understood that neglect itself had a pattern. She set the satchel on the floor and wiped one small section of track with her sleeve. Beneath the dust, metal shone. Outside, the light was leaving fast. She returned to the front room and wedged the door shut from inside with a length of wood she found near the counter. There was no lock she trusted. In the back room, she chose a place beneath the workbench farthest from the broken window, where the floor felt solid and the roof above showed no fresh stain. She spread her coat on the boards, placed the Bible inside the satchel, and used the satchel as a pillow. Cold gathered as soon as the sun disappeared. The building made night sounds, boards eased. Wind touched the loose gutter. Somewhere in the wall a mouse worked at dry paper with patient teeth. The plaster mountain stood black against the dim window, larger in darkness than it had been by day. She could smell rust from the rails, dust from the shelves, and the stale sweetness of old cardboard. Her stomach ached, then quieted. She did not light a candle. She had none. She did not cry. Tears took water, and water had become something to plan around. She lay on her side with both hands tucked beneath her chin, looking across the floor at the model railroad table. In the dark, the miniature station seemed almost occupied. Not visibly, not by ghosts or storybook presences, by attention, by the impression of hands that had measured, cut, painted, sorted, corrected, and left behind a world too careful to be accidental. For the first time in many weeks, no one told her to move. The depot kept its silence around her. It had been waiting, and so had she. At first light, she learned the building by where it objected to her weight. The floor near the front counter gave a hollow answer when she stepped too close to the wall. The second board inside the door dipped under her left foot, then rose again with a tired wooden sigh. In the back room, the safer path ran along the north wall past the drawers-marked figures and brass tube, then angled toward the workbench where the joists underneath still held firm. She marked that path in her mind before she marked anything with chalk. A body without money had to become its own surveyor. The first 3 days were not romantic days. They were water days, cold days, inventory days, days of learning how little a person could require when a roof, however wounded, stood between her and the weather. The nearest usable water came from a hand pump beside an unused stock trough 1/2 mile down the lane, on a farm whose mailbox listed no name, only a painted number. The first morning she approached the pump with both hands visible and no expectation of welcome. No one came out. A curtain shifted once in the house. She filled a dented coffee can she had found under the depot counter, then another, then carried them back one at a time, spilling less on the second trip. The outhouse stood behind the depot in a screen of sumac, its door hanging on one hinge and its crescent moon cutout plugged with a bird's nest. She cleared the nest carefully and set it beneath the bushes. The seat was cracked, the pit almost full of leaves blown in over years, but it served after she scraped, swept, and spread a layer of wood ash from a rusted barrel near the chimney clean-out. Dignity, she had discovered, could be built from unpleasant tasks done without witness. She did not go into town the first day except to ask at the municipal desk where she could draw public water if the pump failed. Mrs. Hirschberger was not there. A younger clerk gave her directions to a spigot behind the borough maintenance shed and did not ask where she was staying. That restraint seemed to be the custom of the place. People noticed. People measured. Then they let silence remain silence until need made it speak. The depot had 4 rooms if one counted generously: front counter room, large back workshop, a narrow storage closet, and a lean-to addition at the rear that had once housed lumber and plaster sacks. The lean-to was too compromised to use. Rain had entered there for years, leaving the floor dark, buckled, and soft as cake beneath the top skin. She shut that door and placed a chair against it, not because the chair made any true barrier, but because warning sometimes mattered as much as strength. The chimney became her first concern. Not because she was ready to use it, but because cold was coming with a patience no person could out-talk. The brick fireplace in the front room had a narrow firebox, more like a stove opening than a hearth, with a rusted iron grate and a damper that would not move at first. She lay on her back with a flashlight made weak by old batteries and looked upward into darkness. Creosote hung there in black scales. Bird twigs filled the smoke shelf. Something small and dead, perhaps a squirrel, had dried into a shape she could not name. She withdrew, coughing, and sat on the floor until the dizziness passed. On the second day, she opened drawers. Not all of them. Only those that moved without forcing. Walter had taught her that stuck drawers should be treated like sore joints. Warm them if you can. Work them evenly. Never punish wood for swelling in weather it did not choose. The drawers gave up dull X-Acto blades wrapped in tape, empty paint bottles, bent rail joiners, cracked plastic figures, a coil of green wire, dried glue, 2 brass screws, a narrow file with rust at the tang, and a packet of labels printed long ago in blue ink. On the lower shelf beneath the main workbench she found 3 jars of scenery powder still sealed, their labels faded but readable: Earth Blend, Cinder, Autumn Weed. 1 jar had broken, scattering fine brown powder across the shelf, where mice had walked through it and left tiny tracks like a record of weather. She placed salvageable items in lines on the counter, not to admire them, but to know what was true. On the 3rd day, her feet carried her into Strasburg because repair required something more than will. The hardware store stood 2 blocks off the busiest tourist walk in a brick building with a green awning and windows crowded by snow shovels, lamp wicks, mouse traps, canning lids, brass hinges, stovepipe sections, and a hand-lettered card offering key-cutting while you waited. A bell rang above the door when she entered. Heat struck her face, so did the smell of machine oil, burlap, seed packets, paraffin, pine boards, and old metal. Behind the counter stood a man broad through the shoulders with a trimmed white beard, wire-rim glasses, and hands nicked by years of handling sharp edges. His red flannel shirt was buttoned to the throat and a carpenter's pencil rested above one ear. He was not tall, but he had the settled presence of a man who knew exactly where every nail bin stood in the store and could tell by sound when a customer opened the wrong drawer. "Morning," he said. "Morning, sir." He watched her take in the shelves, noted the satchel, noted the coat, noted, without speaking of it, that she had come to buy necessity and not convenience. "I need to clean a chimney," she said. His eyebrows moved. "What kind?" "Brick. Small firebox. Closed since the late 90s. Creosote in scales. Bird nest above the smoke shelf. Damper frozen." The carpenter's pencil came down from his ear. "You know those words." "I know some of them." "What building?" She gave the road, not the full story. He looked toward the window, then back at her. "Miniature place?" "Yes, sir." County finally gave that away. Sold it. For what? She did not answer immediately. Something in his face said he already knew enough not to press. He nodded once. "Name's Amos Rutt." He came around the counter with a limp that showed only when he turned. The store floor was worn smooth between the aisles, and he moved through it without looking down. He set out items one by one on a square of brown paper. Wire chimney brush, 6-inch, with jointed rods, dust mask, leather gloves from a bin marked irregular, drop cloth, stiff hand brush, small galvanized bucket, scraper, flashlight batteries, mouse traps, stove cement, and a booklet with a faded cover showing a man in suspenders repairing a fieldstone wall. She looked at the growing pile and felt her chest tighten before her face changed. "I cannot buy all that today." Amos leaned both hands on the counter. "What can you buy today?" "Maybe the batteries. 1 dust mask." He considered her. Then he opened a ledger from beneath the counter, turned to a blank page, and wrote her name though she had not given it. He had heard it somewhere already. Or Mrs. Hirschberger had told him. or small towns had wires of their own. Finer than copper. I run accounts, he said. I do not have wages. Did not say wages. I cannot promise when I can pay. You can promise whether you mean to. She looked down at the items. The leather gloves had one thumb darker than the other. The chimney brush had bristles stiff enough to scrape her palm raw if mishandled. The booklet's title read Practical Repairs for Farm and Outbuilding. Revised 1978. I mean to, she said. Then say it plain. I mean to pay you. Good, he wrote again. Account opened. She stood very still. Sir? You do not know me. He tore the page's corner with the total and placed it beside the supplies. I know a liar quicker than a bank knows a signature. You are not polished enough for lying. That could have been insult or mercy. In his voice it became neither. It became a workable fact. He tapped the booklet. Manuals free. Covers ugly. But Chapter 2 will keep you from killing yourself with smoke. Read it twice before you light anything. 3 times if you're proud. I am not proud. Everybody's proud when cold enough. The first supply list came to $32.86 written carefully in Amos Rutt's ledger beneath her name. He discounted the gloves to no charge because the stitching was uneven, though she could see they were stronger than her bare hands. He sold the batteries at cost. The chimney brush and rods were $16. The dust mask was $1.75. The stove cement was $3.49. The drop cloth, canvas and stained, was $2 because it had once been rented and returned with paint on one corner. Mouse traps were 49 cents each, 4 for $1.80. The hand brush was $2.25. The galvanized bucket was $4.50. He wrapped the smaller goods in newspaper, tied the rods with twine, and carried the whole bundle to the door. Do not stand under the flue when you break the nest loose. No, sir. Do not use gasoline. No, sir. Do not burn pine scrap indoors unless you like chimney fires. No, sir. If the damper does not move after cleaning, come back before forcing it. Yes, sir. He opened the door and looked past her toward the street. And eat something. She lowered her eyes. I will. Say it plain. I will eat something. He gave her half of his own lunch wrapped in wax paper, without naming it. She accepted it because refusal would have been vanity, and the manual had already warned against pride. Back at the depot she read Chapter 2 twice, sitting on the floor in her coat, then a third time with her finger moving under the lines. The instructions were blunt and unadorned. Inspect from below if roof access is unsafe. Protect room from soot. Remove obstruction before brushing. Work rods in short sections. Do not overreach test draft with twisted paper before building fire. Watch for smoke reversal. Never leave first fire unattended. The cleaning took 6 hours the first day and nearly 4 the next. She began by covering the front room with the stained canvas drop cloth, tucking its edges beneath bricks and the legs of the counter. She tied a scarf over her hair, put on the dust mask, then worked the damper with light taps from a scrap of wood until the rust gave a 1/4 inch. She scraped the ledge beneath it first. Soot fell in dry flakes, black and shining on one side. She filled the bucket twice before reaching the bird nest. The nest resisted as if woven into the chimney itself. Straw, twigs, twine, feathers, one blue thread, and brittle leaves packed together by seasons. She pulled it loose a little at a time, crouched to the side the way Amos had warned, and still soot dropped across her sleeve in a heavy black breath. After the nest came the brush. 1 rod, twist upward, pull down. 2nd rod, twist upward, pull down. She kept the movement steady and never forced the brush through a narrow place. Creosote rained into the firebox in scales and curls, some as thin as paint chips, others thick as bark. Twice she had to stop and go outside because coughing made her eyes water until she could not see. The cold air cut her throat clean. Then she went back in. By late afternoon of the second day, the brush reached higher without resistance. The damper moved fully. A pale circle of sky was visible far above when she angled the flashlight just right. She cleaned the smoke shelf with the scraper wrapped in a rag, then brushed again, then swept the hearth and carried the soot outside to a pit behind the sumac. Her hands shook when she finished. Not from emotion. From labour and cold and too little food. She gathered fuel from the property, choosing only dry hardwood deadfall from beneath the walnuts and a broken piece of oak chair, too ruined by mice to save. No pine, no painted wood, no mystery scraps. She laid the fire as the manual instructed. 2 small split sticks, twist of newspaper kindling crossed loosely, no burden of heavy wood until draught was proven. At dusk, she twisted a strip of newspaper, lit it with a match Amos had tucked into the package, and held it near the damper. The flame leaned inward. She waited. Then she lit the fire. Smoke rose, hesitated at the throat, and went up. She crouched there, both hands on her knees, watching the first honest flame take hold in the depot. It was a modest fire, no larger than a basin at first, but it altered the room. Brick warmed, shadows lifted from the floor, the cash register shell took on a dull glow along one edge. The old calendar trembled slightly in the air current. For supper. She boiled water in the coffee can and softened a handful of oats given by a church pantry in a paper sack. She added salt from a packet saved from the bus station and ate with a plastic spoon found behind the counter. Washed 3 times. The meal had no sweetness, no butter, no milk. It was hot. Hot was enough. That night she slept nearer the front room, but not too near the fire. The manual lay open beside her. The chimney drew clean until the last coal dulled. She woke twice to check it. Each time the building felt less like an abandoned object, and more like a patient creature whose breath had been cleared. Only after heat became possible did she allow herself to inventory the workroom properly. She began at the door and moved clockwise. Notebook page torn from the back of the manual folded against a piece of cardboard. The room deserved method. Disorder had happened to it for too many years. Workbench 1, stripwood rack, mostly basswood, some warped beyond use. 3 unopened packets of scale lumber, 2 metal rulers, 1 cutting mat brittle at the corners, 11 dried paint jars, 2 usable sable brushes stored bristles up, which made her wince, 4 glue bottles hardened solid, a tin of sewing pins, 9 rail spikes in a matchbox. Shelf above, back issues of Model Railroader from 1972, 1974, 1979, and 1983, 1 Pennsylvania Railroad employee timetable from 1961, 3 envelopes of photographs showing bridges, culverts, farm lanes, and 1 brick station with a man standing partly out of frame, a cigar box containing switch stands, miniature barrels, and 1 cow missing a leg. Workbench 2, magnifying lamp, cord cracked and unsafe, soldering iron with cloth cord, also unsafe, roll of rosin core solder, small vise, bent tweezers, brass tube sorted by diameter in paper sleeves, a drawer of resistors, each value labelled in faded pencil, 2 toggle switches, 6 grain of wheat bulbs, 3 tiny lampshades painted green. Under the bench, plaster sacks hardened into blocks, a coffee can of sifted stone, 1 jar of real coal crushed fine, a shoebox labelled Trees Winter, containing armatures twisted from wire and wrapped in tape, a wooden box of cork roadbed, 2 rolls of brittle scenic paper, bone mason jar full of screws sorted by no principle she could detect, except perhaps the mood of the sorter, east wall pegboard with a handsaw still in place, coping saw missing blade, small hammer, awl, square, plumb bob, chalk line, and 3 empty outlines where finer tools had once hung. Beside the pegboard, a nail held a canvas apron stiff with age. In its pocket she found a pencil sharpened to a needlepoint, a folded grocery receipt from 1986, and a brass track gauge wrapped in tissue. South corner, damaged diorama with church. Platform and sagging hill. Water damage severe. Salvage possible in sections Center table, large railroad landscape, roughly 12 feet by 18 feet, timber frame sound at north end, questionable at southwest leg. Track oxidized but continuous in visible portions. Tunnel through mountain. Rear access unknown. She copied each note in abbreviated lines. Because paper was limited. What she did not write. She spoke quietly once, as Walter had done when checking a list. Speaking made memory stronger. It also made the room less empty without pretending it was not empty. The large layout resisted classification. It was not a museum-quality model, yet it contained passages of extraordinary precision. The hillside near the tunnel had been sculpted in layers, plaster over screen over lath, with exposed rock faces carved while half set. Whoever made it understood Pennsylvania ridges. The stone cuts were not decorative. They bore the angle of sediment, the weathered shelves where frost would open seams. The tunnel portal was cast plaster, scribed to resemble limestone block, each joint painted with a slightly darker wash. Above it, scrub trees clung to a steep slope where no farmer would have planted them, their trunks bent by imagined wind. She tapped the fascia with her knuckle. Solid. She tapped farther down. Solid again. The anomaly announced itself by refusing to sound like the rest. It happened near the west side of the mountain, below a slope covered with faded laurel bushes. Her knuckle met plaster, but beneath it came a lower note, not hollow exactly, not open but different. She tapped again with 2 fingers. Then she went to the opposite side of the mountain and tapped the mirrored place. That side answered sharp and shallow. The west side answered with a kept silence behind it. She stopped. A person who has been disappointed often learns to distrust discovery. There is a way hope can imitate a trap. She did not reach for a tool at once. She continued the inventory. She swept under the table. She checked the legs. She followed the track with a cloth and found 2 breaks near the trestle. Both repairable. She ate oats. She slept. In the morning the different sound remained where she had left it. She performed the tests Walter had taught her, though he had taught them for warped doors and hidden voids in model bases, not secrets. Sound test first, light tap with knuckle, then with the wooden handle of the hand brush, moving in a grid no wider than her palm. She marked each change with chalk dots on the fascia, not on the scenery. The lower note formed a rough oval behind the mountain face. Weight test second. She pressed gently along the slope, feeling for flex. No movement. She pressed beneath the table, reaching along the timber frame where dust lay thick as felt. One support board under the mountain had been cut shorter than its neighbours and capped by a circular plug of cedar, darkened with age. The cedar disc was no larger than a jar lid. It sat flush in a square panel hidden above eye level if one stood, but visible from below if one lay on the floor and knew to look. A single brass screw held it, the slot filled with wax and dust. Around the disc, pencil marks had been rubbed almost away. She could make out 2 letters, perhaps W and L, or M and I, joined by a line. She lay on her back beneath the table for several minutes, looking up at it. Then she crawled out, washed her hands, and cleared the workbench. The screw did not want to turn. She cleaned the slot with a sewing pin, brushed away wax, then used the narrow file as a makeshift driver because the screwdriver from the front drawer was too wide. The brass complained, then moved 1 fraction. She stopped, started again, quarter turn, half turn, full. The screw came free into her palm, warm from friction. The cedar disc remained in place until she used the awl gently at its edge. It loosened. Behind it was darkness and the dry smell of closed wood. She expected perhaps wires, a forgotten access hole, a repair note. She had prepared herself for mice. Instead, her fingers touched twine. The compartment was built into the mountain's timber core, protected by plaster above and fascia below. It was not large, but it was deep enough to hold several wrapped packages stacked with exact intention. She drew the first one out slowly. Brown paper, oil darkened at the folds, tied with cotton string, A second followed, smaller, then a third, long and narrow. Behind them sat a zinc box, dull grey, its edges white with oxidation, wrapped once in waxed cloth. She did not open them under the table. She placed each package on the workbench in order of removal. Then she sat on the chair, hands folded between her knees, until her breathing settled into something useful. The long, narrow package came first. She untied the string without cutting it and smoothed the paper flat. Inside lay tools, not grand tools, not silver or jewelled, not the sort displayed under glass, a set of heirloom miniature files with pearwood handles darkened by fingers, 2 pin vises, 1 brass, 1 blackened steel, a pair of tweezers finer than any she had held since Walter's vanished gift, a hand drill with bits wrapped in oiled paper, a burnisher made from a deer antler tip set into maple, a tiny machinist's square, a brush holder made from walnut, drilled with 12 holes, 6 still holding brushes whose points had been shaped and protected by paper sleeves. She lifted the tweezers first. The tips met without daylight between them. She set them down before her hand could tighten too hard. The smaller package contained raw material, brass strip, nickel-silver rail, sleeves of copper wire thin as hair, sheets of mica, a packet of scale brick paper printed in muted reds, 2 envelopes of ground pigment labelled by hand, soot from engine 475, Julie 19664, and red clay Gap Road cut. There were also tiny bags of ballast, each marked with location and date, as though gravel itself had ancestry. The larger brown paper package held books and papers, notebooks filled with diagrams, templates for bridge trusses, wiring plans for hidden lighting, photographs of dioramas under construction, and a small linen pouch containing carved figures no taller than a fingernail, a farmer, a girl with a basket, a conductor, a woman seated on a bench, hands folded in her lap, face indicated by only 3 brush touches and yet somehow weary. Last came the zinc box. It had no lock, only a clasp stiffened by corrosion. She cleaned the hinge with a brush, worked it slowly, and opened it on the 3rd careful pull. Inside were layers. On top lay a folded letter sealed in an envelope gone ivory with age. The handwriting across it was not addressed by name. It said, "For the careful hands that find this." Beneath the letter was a cloth bundle tied in blue ribbon, a leather envelope, and a small metal case with a snap lid. She removed the cloth bundle first. Paper money lay inside, old notes banded in groups, some with red seals, some silver certificates, some later bills from the 1960s and early 1970s, all flattened and kept away from damp. She did not trust her first count. She counted once, then sorted by denomination, then counted again with a pencil mark for each stack. The total came to $41,073. The cents were not an accident. They lay in a small tobacco tin at the bottom of the cloth bundle, 5 mercury dimes, 9 wheat pennies, 3 silver quarters, 1 1964 Kennedy $half, 2 buffalo nickels worn nearly smooth, and a single steel cent dark as a rain cloud. The odd 73 cents seemed to have been kept because nothing in that compartment had been treated as too minor to matter. The leather envelope contained stock certificates. Railroad companies, some familiar from Walter's stories, some names folded into larger companies long ago, Pennsylvania Railroad Reading Company, Lehigh Valley, Norfolk and Western, Baltimore and Ohio, a few bore dates from the 1960s, some had coupons attached, some had transfer stamps. She did not understand their present worth, or whether they had any. She knew only that they had been protected with the same care as the tools. The metal case held a military medal. The ribbon had faded but remained intact, folded around the medal and a typed card. The card gave a name, a rank, a unit, and the year 1944. The medal itself was not polished. It had the dull dignity of an object handled rarely and never for display. Beside it lay a black and white photograph of a young man in uniform standing near a station platform, one hand resting on a duffel bag, his smile restrained as though leaving had already placed distance between him and whoever held the camera. She placed the medal apart from the money. Then she placed the letter apart from everything. The room had changed, though nothing visible had moved except her hands. Outside evening pressed against the windows. The fire in the front room had fallen low. She had meant to read the letter at once. Any other person might have torn it open first, before counting, before sorting, before washing soot from the fingertips. But the envelope seemed heavier than the cash, heavier than the certificates, heavier even than the tools. It required a readiness she did not yet possess. So she did not read it. She returned every bill to its cloth bundle, every coin to the tobacco tin, every certificate to the leather envelope. She closed the zinc box but did not put it back beneath the mountain. Instead, she set it on the workbench and laid both hands flat beside it. Her palms were dirty, the dirt had entered the fine lines around her knuckles, the half-moons of her nails, the cracks opened by cold. She looked at those hands and remembered the clerk saying Walters were steady. She remembered Amos saying pride could grow in the cold. She remembered Lorraine's door closing with its clean domestic click, and the way that sound had tried to name the rest of her life. The depot made its night noises. Mouse in the wall. Gutter in wind. A loose piece of tin ticking once, then again. She put on her coat and went outside. The yard behind the building sloped toward the stone culvert, where water moved under a skim of ice and came out sounding clearer than it looked. Walnut branches crossed overhead, bare and black against a sky clearing after cloud. Stars had begun appearing between them, not many, but enough to give the dark a grain. She walked to the creek edge and stood there with her arms folded around herself. The water did not hurry. It passed under the road, over flat stones, around a branch caught crosswise at the bank. It carried walnut husks, thin ice, a yellow leaf that had outlasted season, and the reflection of one star broken again and again by motion. Inside the depot, the letter waited. Inside the mountain, absence waited where the box had been. She stayed by the water until cold moved from her sleeves into her shoulders and from her shoulders into her jaw. Then she turned back toward the building, with no light in its windows except the faint red of coals through the front room grate. It had been waiting, and so had she. Morning came in without warmth, but with enough light to make handwriting visible. Faye woke before the fire was ready to be coaxed back, before the road gave its first tire sound, before the hound beyond the fence began its professional announcements to the day. Frost had gathered on the inside of the broken window in a white fringe, and the workroom breathed the kind of cold that made metal shrink from touch. She sat up beneath the bench, coat pulled to her chin, and looked at the zinc box where it waited on the work table. The letter lay beside it. She had placed it there after coming in from the water, not on top of the money, not beneath the tools, but apart, as though paper could require space around itself. The envelope had darkened at the corners. Its flap was sealed with wax gone brittle and brown. Across the front, the words remained clear despite years in darkness. For the careful hands that find this. She warmed her fingers at the small fire first, not from delay, but because a person should not handle old paper with hands that could not feel. She boiled water in the coffee can, drank it plain, then wiped the table with a clean corner of the drop cloth. Every motion became slower than ordinary. The depot seemed to understand. Even the loose gutter outside had quieted. When she lifted the envelope, she noticed something she had missed the night before. The handwriting leaned slightly right, each letter built with exact pressure, dark at the downstroke and lighter at the turn. It resembled Walter's handwriting in the way a daughter's face might resemble a grandmother's, not identical, but belonging to the same narrow river. The capital W had the same restrained loop. The lowercase t crossed itself with a short, level mark. The final S rested low, nearly closed. She set the envelope down. Then she took the thin knife from the workbench, slid it beneath the flap, and opened the seal without tearing the paper. Inside were 8 folded pages. She unfolded them once, then again, following the original creases. The first line stood alone. My dear one, whoever you are, If you have found this letter, then the mountain has finally been opened, and the hands that opened it were not greedy hands. Greedy hands break plaster. Careful hands listen first. I have hidden this box where noise and hurry will not think to look, and if many years have passed, then perhaps silence has done what I asked of it. My name is Eleanor May Whitcomb, though in shop records I was sometimes written as E.M. Whitcomb because men buying custom work trusted initials more than a woman's name. I am writing from Strasburg, Pennsylvania on the 21st day of October 1967 after returning from Philadelphia, where Dr. Samuel R. Klein at Pennsylvania Hospital told me what I had already begun to know in my bones. The cancer is in my lungs and in the lining near my ribs. He spoke gently. I appreciated that gentleness does not change the road, but it may keep a person from stumbling while taking the first steps upon it. I have no child living who can receive this shop in the ordinary way. I have no husband living, no brother living, and no son living. The courthouse will call this a problem of inheritance. I call it the consequence of wars, pride, bad luck, and families waiting too long to say the one sentence that might have brought them home. So I write to you, unknown careful one. Perhaps you are blood. Perhaps not. Blood is a road. But it is not the only road. A trade also carries a person forward. A house does too. If someone leaves the latch where an honest hand may find it. This work began before me. My great-grandfather Matthias Whitcomb, born 1829 near Truro in Cornwall, came to Pennsylvania in 1854 with a box of tin tools, a slate pencil, and the habit of making large things small enough to understand. He worked first in iron furnaces near Safe Harbor, then carved mind maps and incline models for men who needed to show investors what could not yet be seen underground. His son, Josiah Whitcomb, born 1861 in Lancaster County, made display models for farm machinery companies and surveyors, building little barns with rafters in their proper order and stone culverts with the right number of courses. Josiah's daughter, Lydia Ann Whitcomb, born 1884 outside Paradise Township, learned scale work by sweeping his bench and stealing broken scraps from the kindling basket. She had finer hands than any of them and less permission to use them. Lydia was my mother. I was born in 1911 in the room behind this very workshop, when it was still a repair shed for lanterns, model bridges and travellers' clocks. My father, Henry Abel Whitcomb, kept accounts and soldered switch lamps. My mother carved, painted, wired and corrected the work men believed father had done. By 1929, when the railway orders slowed and the banks began closing their fists, mother had already turned the shop toward miniature railroad landscapes, town models and teaching displays. She said people would always need a way to see what they had lost. Our name was never famous. That spared us vanity. We built for county fairs, station windows, children's rooms, school exhibits, railroad men retiring from work that had taken their backs, and widows who brought one photograph of a depot and asked whether it could be made again before memory blurred the roofline. We did not make toys. We made witnesses. The trade closed by inches. As most trades do, it did not fall in one storm. Plastic kits came in bright boxes. Department stores sold ready-made towns whose windows all shone the same yellow. Men who once ordered custom bridges began saying children would not know the difference. Perhaps they were right. Children often forgive what adults make careless. But the final day came on March 14, 1964, when the last railroad client cancelled the Strasburg Junction Commission by letter and asked whether his deposit could be returned. I still have that letter in the third ledger. If mice have not eaten it, I returned the deposit. Then I locked the front door and opened only for repairs, favours and old customers who came more to remember than to purchase. For more than 30 years in my own heart, and for nearly 4 since the door closed to the public, I have kept silence with people I should have written. My brother Thomas went west after an argument with father over money and pride. I let the silence remain because I was young enough to believe years were plentiful. Then the depression scattered addresses, and the war scattered men, and after that I no longer knew where apology should be sent. If you come from Thomas's line, I ask pardon. If you come from no line of ours at all, accept the warning instead. Silence feels clean while it is being kept. but it grows teeth in the dark. My husband, Peter Albright Whitcomb, served with the United States Army in the Second World War and was killed in Belgium in January 1945 during the winter fighting that emptied so many houses of their ordinary voices. My brother Thomas, from whom I was estranged, was lost at sea in 1942 while serving in the Merchant Marine, though I did not learn this until years later through a notice sent to an address already abandoned. My only son, David Peter Whitcomb, lived long enough to wear his father's eyes and my mother's patience. He served in Korea and died of fever after returning in 1953 at a hospital in Harrisburg. Grief is not one room, it is a house added onto over time, each loss building another narrow hallway. If the medal remains in this box, it was Peter's, do not sell it. If the certificates remain, have a patient lawyer or bank officer explain them before trusting any quick answer. Some may be worthless, some may not. Money has been placed here not for splendor but for time, time to repair a roof, time to eat without bargaining against your own hunger, time to choose your next act with a clear head, spend it slowly, and never to impress anyone. The tools are the better inheritance. If you intend to learn the work, begin with ground, not buildings. A poor hill ruins a fine station. Mix plaster 2 parts to 1 part sifted paper pulp for lightness, and add dry pigment before water if the cut face must show stone. Warm water quickens the set, but do not use it unless you're ready. For carved rock, let the plaster firm until it holds a thumbnail mark without closing. That is usually 12 to 18 minutes in this shop during autumn, longer in winter. Use a dull knife first, then a dental pick, then a stiff brush before it fully cures. Stone has direction. Learn that before making cliffs. For earth, never use one brown. Soil near track holds cinder, oil, iron dust and wind-blown seed. I use 3 parts sifted local clay, 1 part ash, 1 part fine sawdust, and a breath of black pigment, shaken through muslin. Lay glue thin. If glue shines, you have used too much. If grass stands like bristles, crush it with your palm after drying. Nothing in nature stands at attention for long. For water, seal the bed twice with shellac and let it dry a full day each time. Pour resin no deeper than 1/8 inch in a pass, or it will cloud and crack. A creek is darker under banks and lighter where it turns over stone. Drag the last surface with a toothpick when it begins to thicken, not before. Patience makes the current. For wiring, mark every lead twice, once near the source and once near the lamp. Use red for common only if you will remember that you chose it. Men have argued over wire colors longer than they have loved their wives. Twist connections cleanly before solder. Heat the joint, not the solder. Rosin is enough. Acid flux belongs to gutters, not circuits. Test each lamp before burying a mountain over it. I write that sentence with feeling. For brick, print may serve at distance, but close work needs relief. Scribe card with a dull awl. Seal both sides. Paint the mortar first. Then dry brush brick faces in more colours than pride thinks necessary. A building that looks good from 3 feet may die under a magnifier. Let it be honest, close up. For trees, twist more wire than you think. Roots matter even when hidden by ground cover. Use finer branches at the top. And do not make every tree healthy. A railroad edge has broken limbs, volunteer saplings, vines, and one stubborn thing growing from a place where no gardener would approve. Remember that. If there is one rule beneath all others, it is this. Do not make the miniature world cleaner than the real one. Mercy is not neatness. Mercy is attention. You may wonder why I placed the box inside the mountain, because mountains teach proportion. A person standing below one feels small, and smallness rightly understood can save the soul from much foolishness. Also because customers always admired that mountain and never once asked how it was held up. People trust what looks solid. The careful hand asks where the weight goes. Out back. By the walnut tree nearest the culvert, you will find a horseshoe grown into the bark. My mother nailed it there the summer my son was born. She said iron above root kept a house from forgetting who worked in it. I did not believe her. but I never removed it. This house is not much. It leaks. The south wall has leaned since the hurricane rains in 1955. The chimney needs repointing above the roofline. The front sill should be replaced before another winter. The third joist under the counter was sistered badly in 1938 and should not be trusted with heavy weight. I tell you these things because affection without facts is only decoration. If you stay, do not hurry. If you leave, leave kindly. If you sell, sell to someone who will look beneath dust before sweeping it into a bin. If you're hungry, eat. If you're tired, sleep. If you're ashamed of needing what has been left, set that shame down. No one comes to inheritance clean-handed. We receive what others could not carry farther. I have spent many evenings in this room after closing, listening to the trains beyond town and the mice in the wall, wondering whether work can outlive the worker without becoming a museum piece. I think now that it can, but only if another living hand accepts it as unfinished. Finished things belong to display. Unfinished things may yet become shelter. I will fold this letter now and place it above the money, because explanation should lie before use. If the pages smell of smoke, it is because the chimney draws poorly in east wind. If there is a stain near the lower corner, it is not sorrow. I spilled coffee while coughing and refused to copy 8 pages again. My dear one, whoever you are, the fact that you have opened this carefully is enough for me to trust you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor May Whitcomb, Miniature Depot Workshop, Strasburg, Pennsylvania, October 21st, 1967. Faye reached the end and did not move. The pages rested across her lap. Trembling only when the cold entered her hands again, she read the signature once, then looked toward the plaster mountain, the hidden opening, the workbenches, the drawers, the tools laid in their patient rows. The room remained what it had been. Dust, boards, cracked cords, frost along glass, old labels, the smell of soot and plaster. Yet every object now seemed to have stepped forward by 1 degree, identified not as clutter, but as witness. She read the letter a second time. This time she stopped at the practical lines. Third joist under the counter. South wall since the rains. Front sill. Chimney above the roofline. She found a pencil and marked those facts on the back of an envelope. Her face did not change while she wrote. The pencil did. Its point broke at the word chimney. She sharpened it with the knife and continued. When she finished, she folded the pages along the original creases. Not new folds, not convenient folds, the old ones paper remembered, and she would not teach it another shape without need. She placed the letter back in its envelope, not sealing it, and set it beside the tools. Then she stood, took her coat from the chair, and went to the back door. The yard had thawed slightly under a thin sun. Frost withdrew from grass tips and left them dark. The culvert water sounded louder by daylight, perhaps because she now knew someone else had listened to it long before her. She walked to the walnut nearest the stone crossing and searched the trunk. At first she saw only bark. The tree had grown broad and deeply furrowed, its trunk twisting as old walnuts do, not straight, but determined. On the creek side, above the height of her waist, iron showed through a wound in the bark. The horseshoe had been almost swallowed. One curve remained visible, black with age, its nail heads buried in living wood. The tree had grown around it without surrendering it, taking the iron into itself and keeping the shape. Faye touched it with 2 fingers. The iron was cold. She stood there until a crow crossed the field behind her. Wing beats slow against the pale sky. Then she returned to the depot, gathered deadfall, and built the fire higher than she had dared the day before. Still modest, still watched, but steady enough to warm brick to its core. Among the heirlooms was a short beeswax candle wrapped in paper and tied with thread. She had found it in the zinc box beneath the medal case, overlooked at first because it was the colour of old linen. The paper around it read Workshop Candle, Christmas 1907, in a hand even older than Eleanor's. The wick had darkened, but the wax still carried the faint honeyed smell of some summer no person alive could remember. Faye did not light it for brightness. The room had daylight. She set the candle in the coffee mug filled with dead flies, after emptying it, washing it, and weighting the bottom with 3 clean stones from the creek. Then she struck a match from Amos's packet, cupped the flame, and held it to the wick. For several seconds. Nothing happened. Then the wick caught with a blue bead, leaned, straightened, and gave a small gold flame. The smell changed at once. Beeswax, dust, cooling soot, damp wool, old wood. The flame did not conquer the room. It made one circle of light on the bench, touching the tweezers, the folded letter, the brass pin vise, and the edge of the medal case. That was enough. A person could begin with one circle. She sat before it with both feet on the floor. The line of kindnesses that had brought her there did not appear as an idea, but as faces and hands doing modest things without ceremony. The bus station guard in Lancaster, silver moustache and tired eyes, telling her to wait till 5 before moving. The volunteer in Reading placing peanut butter crackers into a napkin as if no form were required for mercy. Mrs. Hirschberger pressing the brass stamp, then placing the worn bills in a drawer where ordinary money did not go. Amos Rutt writing her name into a ledger and asking her to say plainly that she meant to pay. None of them had saved her life in the grand manner people make speeches about. They had each moved one latch. That was all. One latch. Then another, until a locked life found a door that opened inward. And maybe while you're listening there is one such kindness you have carried longer than you realized. Not a grand rescue, not a public gift. Perhaps somebody let you sit where you were not supposed to sit because the night was cold. Perhaps a neighbour left soup in a jar and walked away before thanks became awkward. Perhaps a teacher kept the room open after the bell. Or a stranger paid a fare, or someone used your name carefully when you had begun to feel invisible. If you remember one, write it down somewhere, even if only in the comments beneath this story. Small kindnesses are easily lost when nobody gives them a place to rest. By late afternoon, the candle had burned down only a little, leaving a soft rim of wax along one side. Faye pinched it out with damp fingers and saved what remained. Waste had no place in a room that had waited through so many winters. She wrapped the tools again, not hiding them, only protecting them from cold and damp. The money returned to the zinc box. The certificates went beneath the cloth bundle. The medal remained beside the letter for the night. She set Walter's Bible beside Eleanor's pages, 2 old papers from 2 different branches of silence, both kept by hands that had not known whether they would be needed. Before sleeping, she checked the fire, the door wedge, the broken window, the path across the floor, and the compartment beneath the mountain. She did not put the box back inside. The mountain had done its duty. Now the duty had moved to her. She lay beneath the workbench with the wrapped heirloom tools on one side and the folded letter on the other. The medal case rested above her on the bench, close enough that if the building shook, she would hear it move. Outside, water passed beneath the culvert. A walnut branch touched the roof once, then again, in the wind. Inside, the room held its objects in stillness. Faye closed her eyes with both hands tucked under her cheek, not empty-handed any more, and slept as the house kept watch. The first snow arrived on December 3rd, a patient fall of 4.5 inches that began before dawn and made every broken thing look temporarily forgiven. By 7, the walnut branches were lined in white. The gravel spur vanished under a single unmarked sheet. The roof of the depot held the snow for almost an hour, then began confessing where it could not bear weight. Along the seam above the workroom, meltwater appeared first as a dark line, then as a bead, then as a steady drip into the bucket Faye had placed beneath the stain. In the lean-to, The sound was worse. There, water did not drip. It entered in several places, ticking on ruined boards, striking one overturned plaster sack, tapping the metal lid of an old paint tin with the irritating precision of a clock. She stood in the back room wearing both shirts, her sweater, her coat, and the leather gloves Amos had put on account. Her breath showed faintly in the air. On the large layout, the plaster mountain caught some reflection from the snow outside and seemed almost moonlit. But she did not stop to look long. Beauty could wait, water could not. The manual's roofing chapter was not long, which made it more demanding. It assumed the reader could understand plain instruction and would not ask a sentence to do the work of a ladder. Faye read the chapter once beside the fire, then again at the workbench with a pencil, then a third time sitting on the floor beneath the drip, where the reason for every line made itself known. Remove failed material, inspect decking, replace unsound boards, lay felt from low to high, overlap properly, keep courses straight, flash penetrations, do not trust tar where structure has failed. She copied the measurements into her notebook. Main roof, 40 feet by 18 feet. Shallow pitch. Existing tar paper over deteriorated cedar shingles. Allow overhang and waste. South edge compromised. Chimney flashing failed. Rear lean-to not repairable under winter conditions, temporary covering only. The calculation took most of the morning because numbers had to become weight had to become cost, and cost had to become a conversation she dreaded having. She measured with twine and a broken folding rule found in the workroom, marking lengths by knots and pencil. By noon she had determined she needed 10 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles for the main roof if she kept waist narrow, 2 rolls of 15-pound roofing felt, 4 pounds of 101/4-inch galvanized roofing nails, 2 pieces of step flashing for the chimney side, thone The list looked too large on paper. She took it to Amos anyway. The hardware store had begun preparing for Christmas. A row of sleds stood near the front window. Strings of modest white lights hung above the paint counter. There was a cardboard display of pocket knives near the register, and a basket of pine cones scented with cinnamon, though the smell lost against machine oil and stove rope Amos read her list without raising his eyebrows. You measured twice. Yes, sir. Ruth measured back. Yes, sir. He made a small sound that might have been approval if one needed it badly enough. Then he wrote prices beside each line, slowly, not hiding anything. Shingles, $13 a bundle because they were mismatched leftovers from a discontinued color. Felt, $9 a roll. Nails, $4.60 for the box boards, $7 each. Flashing, $3 a piece. Roof cement, $2.90. Plywood scrap from the back, no charge if she accepted narrow cuts. Delivery by his nephew's truck, $5 added to account unless she wanted to carry shingles through town on her spine. I will need delivery, she said. Good. I was hoping your common sense survived the snow. From beneath the counter he brought out an old roofing hatchet. Its head was dark, its cutting edge honed clean, and the handle had been wrapped near the end with black tape polished by use. My brother used this, Amos said, before his shoulder quit him. I cannot buy that. Did not say buy. She touched the handle with 2 gloved fingers but did not lift it. Borrow. Use. There is a difference. There is... I chose my word. He placed it on top of the shingles when his nephew loaded the truck that afternoon. The nephew, a sandy-haired man named Eli, drove slowly down the gravel spur and said almost nothing as he carried bundles to the north side of the building, stacking them on boards so snowmelt would not soak the wrapping. Before leaving, he looked up at the roof and then toward Faye. My uncle says you need a ladder that does not lie. I have none. He returned an hour later with an extension ladder, paint splattered but sound, and a shorter roof ladder with hooks wrapped in cloth. He said, bring these. He also said, do not thank him more than once. Thank you, she said. That is once. The skilled elder came the next morning just after 8, walking up the snowy track with a canvas tool roll under one arm and a wool cap pulled low over ears that had seen many winters. He was lean, bent slightly forward at the shoulders, with a white beard trimmed short and eyes pale from age but not softened by it. His name was Mr. Silas Wenger. He had roofed barns, carried sheds, and one covered bridge repair before retiring, though he did not use the word retired. He said only that his knees had become selective. Amos says you mean to climb, he said. Yes, sir. Meaning is not footing. No, sir. He looked at the building, the snow, the sag in the south line. He looked at her boots, then at her hands, then at the stack of shingles. I do not take pay for telling a person where not to step. I have no pay to offer. Then we are agreed. He refused coffee because she had none. He refused water because he had brought a jar. He refused thanks by lifting one hand before she could finish the word. Then he began teaching by correction. The first day was not roofing. It was clearing snow, testing ladder angles, finding rafters from inside, marking safe lines, and pulling away the failed tar paper near the seam. Silas made her tie a rope around the ladder foot and anchor it to the north foundation stone. He made her climb only 4 rungs, descend, climb again, descend, until her feet placed themselves instead of searching. When she reached for the roof edge with one hand too far from her body, he tapped the ladder rail. Closer. She obeyed. Again, she climbed again. For 11 days they worked when weather allowed and prepared when it did not. The sun never gave warmth enough to soften the shingles properly, so Silas kept bundles near the front room fire, just long enough to make them less brittle before they carried them up in small stacks. Faye learned that roofs were not one task, but a sequence of small refusals to let water find privilege. Remove the failed covering, pull proud nails, cut away rot, sister the rafter where the seam had sagged, fastening new lumber alongside old with staggered screws so weakness was not asked to stand alone, replace decking flush never proud, lay felt smooth from lower edge upward, overlapping each course by 4 inches, chalk line every row, trust the line more than the eye. That line's honest, Silas said. snapping blue chalk across felt with 2 fingers blackened by cold. The first time she set a roofing nail, it stood high. Silas bent close. That nail's proud. She looked at it. Pull it. Good. She pulled it with the hatchet claw and set another. He taught the 3-stroke nail, first to place, second to drive, third only if needed, never beating the shingle into submission. He taught her to keep nails high enough not to show, low enough to hold. He taught her to cut tabs from the back when the front granules would dull the blade. He taught her to keep one knee across the ladder rung and never trust frost on shaded shingles. His dialogue rarely exceeded weather. Foot left, not there. Feel the rafter. Watch your shadow. Blade away. Now breathe. She learned more from those clipped instructions than she had learned from whole speeches in school. Each one attached itself to action. Each one prevented harm. On the 5th day, they opened the area round the chimney and found the decking there worse than expected. A board gave under Silas's awl with the soft interior collapse of wood eaten by damp. He made a low sound, then told her to go below and watch for daylight. She stood inside by the firebox while he lifted rot from above. Snowlight appeared through the roof in a narrow wound. Dust came down, a dead wasp, 3 blackened cedar shakes, then Silas's face appeared above the opening for one brief second, upside down and unsmiling. Needs flashing, done right. Yes, sir. Right. Costs less than twice. They replaced the board, fitted step flashing along the chimney, and sealed the joint only where sealant belonged, not where care was missing. Silas hated excess tar with a moral seriousness. Tar is apology, he said. Better not need much. By the 9th day, Faye's palms had blistered beneath the gloves. The hatchet handle raised one raw place where the tape seam rubbed. Her shoulders ached so deeply she woke at night before the cold woke her. She made oats, banked the fire, carried shingles, climbed, knelt, nailed, descended, swept, read the manual again by weak light, and slept without dreams she could remember. Silas came every morning unless the wind was unsafe. He brought no softness, but on the 7th day a boiled egg appeared on the workbench after he left. On the 8th, a heel of bread wrapped in wax paper. On the 10th, nothing, which somehow proved the first 2 had not been a performance. They completed the main roof on December 14th. No sun broke through clouds. No neighbour came to admire. The shingles did not match perfectly. Vone sighed weathered brown, because leftovers had their own history. But the courses lay straight. The felt was covered. The chimney was properly flashed. The seam no longer received the sky. Silas stood in the yard and looked up, both hands resting on the head of his hammer. It will shed. From him. The words were almost a blessing. Faye looked at the roof until her neck ached. Snowmelt gathered along the new edge and dropped cleanly into the rusted gutter, then to the ground outside the wall instead of into the workroom. Inside, the bucket beneath the seam remained empty. That evening, she placed the roofing hatchet beside the hearth, wiped the head with an oiled rag, and wrote the new account total in her notebook. The number was large. The roof was larger. The depot held dry through the night. January entered through brick. The roof now kept most weather above her, but the chimney, once warmed by daily fire, began showing its injuries more clearly. On cold mornings, powdered mortar gathered along the hearth like grey flour. When she brushed the joints near the firebox, grains came away under light pressure. Above the roof line, Silas had already warned her. Several bricks were spalling, their faces flaked by freeze and thaw until the outer skin had separated from the core. A brick could look solid from below and still be losing itself one winter at a time. Faye studied the chimney chapter in the manual until the diagrams became less mysterious. Then she borrowed 3 older books from the library, each with drawings of masonry joints, hearth clearances, flues, draft, and lime mortar. The words were slower than the roofing chapter, more particular. Portland cement too hard for old brick. Lime allows movement. Firebox requires heat-resistant materials. Repoint only after removing failed mortar to proper depth. Dampen joints before packing. Cure slowly. Protect from freezing. She wrote those sentences on paper and pinned them beside the mantel. Amos supplied the materials in smaller amounts than the books described because she had no truck, no mixer, and no business making more mortar than she could place before it stiffened. Hydraulic lime, fine sand, fireclay, a small quantity of refractory cement for the hottest interior repairs, which he told her to use sparingly and not like cake frosting. He also gave her an old pointing trowel with a narrowed tip, a jointer, a stiff masonry brush, and a canvas sack of clean sand that had been sitting in his back room since his father's time. For the outside joints, he said. 2 parts sand, Vone part hydraulic lime, little water. You want it to hold shape. For the firebox, 1 part fireclay, Vone part fine sand, half part refractory cement. Mix small. Wear gloves. Do not smear the face. He wrote the ratios on brown paper in block letters, then made her read them back. She did. Again. She read them again. He nodded. Mortar is not soup. The work lasted 3 weeks because winter would not yield longer pieces of time. Some days the temperature never rose above 22 degrees, and she could do only interior cleaning, scraping old joints by the firebox with the narrow chisel, brushing dust, vacuuming with a hand broom into a tin because there was no electricity for proper tools. Some days sunlight warmed the chimney face enough that she could work outside from the ladder, bundled in every layer she owned, mortar kept in a covered pail near warm brick so it did not stiffen too quickly. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes when detail required removing gloves. She learnt to stop before clumsiness became damage. She would work a joint pack mortar with the pointing trowel, strike it with the jointer, brush the edge clean, then climb down and press her fingers near the fire until pain returned. Pain was useful. It told her the hands were still hers. The spalling bricks above the roofline had to be handled with a restraint that frustrated her at first. She wanted to replace all visibly damaged units, to make the chimney appear renewed. The books and Amos disagreed. Remove only what has failed through. Save sound original brick where possible. Do not improve a thing into losing its history. So she tapped each brick with the wooden handle of the trowel, clear ring, keep, dull crumble, investigate, face flaking but core sound, consolidate and shelter, joint failed, rake and repoint, she worked in narrow sections, never weakening too much at once. Old mortar came out in sandy ribbons, some so loose it could be brushed away with 2 fingers. In places, deeper joints remained firm, and she left them, because not all age was failure. The firebox required a different patience. She removed old ash, scraped cracked mortar from between firebrick, and cleaned each joint with a damp brush. The mix for the firebox was darker, stickier, and less forgiving. Too wet, it slumped. Too dry, it would not pass. She ruined the first batch and carried it outside in the bucket, setting it near the sumac where it hardened into a useless lump. She did not scold herself aloud. Waste had already given its instruction. The second batch held. She pressed it into the joints with the narrow trowel and her gloved fingers, smoothing only enough to remove gaps. When the glove proved too thick, she used a scrap of wood shaped with the file, making a small tool that could reach the back joint without smearing the face of the brick. It took an entire morning to repair an area no wider than 2 hands. Then she had to keep the fire low for days, warming the repair without driving moisture out too quickly. Cold made everything deliberate. Water in the pail skimmed with ice if left near the door. Mortar sand-clumped unless stored by the hearth. The ladder rungs burned through gloves. Her breath clouded the chimney brick when she leaned close, then vanished. She learned to cover fresh exterior work with burlap and a scrap of tarp, weighting it against wind with stones. She checked the cover at night by lantern boots crunching through frozen crust. Once, after sleet began unexpectedly, she rose 3 times before morning to make sure the newest joints were not taking water. No one praised the chimney as it changed. Most of the improvement disappeared into lines between brick. That seemed fitting. The most necessary work often lived between things. On January 23, after a week of curing, she prepared the test fire. She cleaned the grate, opened the damper, warmed the flue with a twisted paper torch, and laid kindling no thicker than fingers. The manual lay on the hearth, though she no longer needed to read that page. Outside, the wind came from the west, steady and dry. Inside, the room held its cold close to the floor. She lit the paper. The flame rose, caught the kindling, and leaned inward with a clean pull. Smoke entered the throat and did not return. She added 1 small split of hardwood. The draught strengthened. No smoke seeped through the repaired joints. No smell of damp soot pressed into the room. The chimney drew as if remembering how. She stood close but not too close, watching for failure. After 20 minutes, the fire remained clean. After 40, brick warmed evenly. After an hour, she placed 1 hand against the side wall near the mantel and felt heat held there, steady and contained, not escaping through broken mortar into wood or air. The powdered grey line that had once gathered each morning did not appear. At dusk, she carried the ash bucket outside and looked up. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, honest column, lifted above the roof, then taken east by the wind. It did not roll downward. It did not hesitate. Amos saw it from the road the next morning, or someone told him, because when she went to the store for lamp oil, he did not ask whether the test had worked. He only said, "Smoke went clean. Yes, sir." He wrote lamp oil on her account and closed the ledger. Good, that was all. It was enough. The floors waited until the roof and chimney stopped demanding first claim. They had endured years of damp air, grit, mouse traffic and careless boots from the county inspector, salvage men, hobby club visitors and animals that had entered through the broken window. But beneath the front room grime lay white pine plank hand-worn wide enough to show the confidence of older trees. In the back workshop the boards were narrower but stronger, fixed with hand-cut rose-head nails in some sections and later wire nails in repaired places. The rose heads pleased Faye more than they should have. Each one sat irregularly, hammered by a person, not a machine, its little facets catching light when cleaned. She began by sweeping for 2 days. Not one large sweeping, many careful ones. First with the stiff broom, removing loose dirt, mouse leavings, plaster flakes, dead insects, and pieces of brittle cardboard. Then with the hand brush along baseboards and under the counter. Then on hands and knees with a rag dampened from the pump, never wet enough to swell the wood. She lifted old tacks with pliers, set aside every nail that might be reused, scraped paint drips with the dull knife, and marked unsafe boards with chalk. The third joist under the counter, as Eleanor's letter had warned, had been badly sistered long ago. Faye did not put weight there until she could brace it temporarily from beneath with a cut length of sound lumber Amos let her take from a scrap pile. It was not a full repair. It was enough to keep honest weight from becoming foolish. The sander was rented from Amos for $14 a day, a random orbit model with a cord he tested twice before handing it over. Electricity remained disconnected at the depot, so the arrangement required an extension run from Amos's nephew's portable generator for one afternoon, paid on account, with the understanding that fuel was not free, and noise would disturb every mouse between Strasburg and Paradise. The generator sat outside the north wall, chugging with an unpleasant insistence. Faye had grown used to hand sounds: broom, trowel, brush, nail. The machine's noise felt crude by comparison, but the floor was too large to scrape entirely by hand before spring. She wore Amos's dust mask, tied a scarf over her hair, and opened the door for ventilation despite the cold. The first pass was 80 grit. It did not beautify, it revealed. Grey lifted in cloudy swirls. Old varnish broke into dull patches. Scratches emerged. Dark stains remained, and some boards showed scars too deep to erase without stealing thickness from the whole floor. She learned quickly not to dwell in one place. Keep moving. Let the grit do its work. Empty dust often. Check paper. Respect nail heads. When the sander caught on a raised rose-head nail, she stopped, set the machine aside, and sank the nail by hand with a punch, tapping lightly until it sat below the surface without bruising the wood. The 80 grit pass took most of the day. By evening, she could see the room's history in uneven colour, pale new scars where water had not reached, dark honey along the traffic path by the counter, grey shadows near the window, and a deep brown patch where someone must once have kept a coal bucket. She swept the dust into paper bags and saved one small jar of the finest powder, because Eleanor's instructions had mentioned earth, ash, sawdust, and memory. It seemed wrong to throw away what the house had surrendered. The second pass, 120 grit, quieted the floor. It softened the rough raised grain without making the boards look new. The pine began taking light differently, not shining, but returning a low warmth. In the back room, she worked around the model table legs by hand, using a sanding block so the timber frame would not be jarred. Dust settled on the plaster mountain, and she brushed it away with a dry paintbrush, whispering an apology to no one in particular. The third pass, 220 grit, was almost tender. By then she could feel the difference through her knees when she knelt. The wood no longer caught at cloth. The rose-head nails sat like small dark stars. The front threshold remained worn into a shallow hollow, and she left it. To level that place would be to erase every foot that had entered before hers. For the finish, Amos argued with himself aloud, and then sold her a small quantity of tung oil and boiled linseed oil, warning her about rags and fire with such severity that she wrote the warning on the wall until the work was done. Oily rags could heat and burn if left folded, lay flat outside. Submerge or burn safely, do not pile, do not trust a rag because it looks tired. The first coat went on thin, rubbed by hand with cloth in the direction of the grain. White pine drank unevenly, some boards darkened at once, others resisted, then warmed slowly. The colour moved from dry straw to dark honey, and in older, denser places near the counter toward mahogany. She waited, wiped excess, waited again, then carried every rag outside and spread them over a wire fence section like strange flags in winter air. 48 hours cure. Second coat. Thinner still. 48 hours cure. Third coat. Only where the wood asked for it. Waiting became part of the work. She could not hurry cure time by wanting the floor beneath her feet. During those days, she moved carefully along paper paths, slept near the hearth, and watched light travel across the boards in slow rectangles. The depot's interior began to sound different. Footsteps no longer gave the dull, powdery answer of neglected wood. They answered with a low, dry note. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without drama after a night of poor sleep. Wind had worried the tarp over the lean-to until she rose twice to secure it. The fire refused to catch cleanly because kindling had taken damp. Her left hand cramped when she tried to button her coat. Oats boiled over into the coals. The account total in her notebook looked larger than the building. The work ahead looked less like a path and more like a field under fog. She sat on the newly finished floor with the spoon in her hand and did not rise. A great blue heron stood there in the shallows, grey and still as a piece of weather. She sat on a fallen log and watched. The morning passed. Ice loosened at the edge of the creek. A truck moved somewhere beyond the trees. The heron lifted one foot, placed it, waited, then struck into the water and came up with something silver, small, alive only for a moment. By noon, the bird opened its wings and rose, not urgently, but because another place had become next. Faye did no work that day. The next morning, she worked again. By February, the windows could no longer be excused as future work. There were 8 altogether, and each had failed in its own temperament. 3 had no glass, only boards or open air where boards had fallen away. 4 were cracked from corner to corner, the fractures held in place by habit, dirt, and one strip of yellowed tape. The last, on the north side of the workroom, remained original to the earliest structure, old wavy glass set in a sash dated by a penciled note beneath the frame, 1788, salvaged from Mill House, installed by J.W., 1932. That pane bent the view of the walnut trees into soft, uneven lines. Faye would not replace it. She began with the missing panes because weather entered there without negotiation. Amos measured the sashes himself when she brought one into the store wrapped in a blanket. He set it on the counter, ran one thumb along the rabbit, and frowned at the old putty hardened like stone. "Do not pry toward the muntin," he said. "No, sir. Score first. Heat helps if careful. I have no heat gun. You have patience." He sold her glazing points, a small glazier's tool, DAP 33 glazing putty, a putty knife with a flexible blade, 2 panes cut to size, and 1 salvaged pane from a storm window in his back room for the 3rd. New glass was flatter than old glass. The salvaged pane had a faint wave and 1 small bubble near the corner. She chose that for the front room where visitors, if any ever came, might look in. The technique was not difficult in theory and humbling in practice. Remove sash, lay flat on padded surface, scrape old putty without splitting wood, pull broken glass, clean rabbit, prime bare wood so oil would not be drawn from the new putty too fast. Knead DAP 33 until workable, lay a thin bedding line, press glass gently, evenly, not at a corner, set glazing points with glazier's tool, firm but not savage, roll putty into a rope, press along edge, draw knife in one clean angle, leaving a bevel that shed water. Do not fuss until ruin. She fussed the first time. The bevel grew lumpy, then thin, then torn. She scraped it out and began again. By the 4th sash, her hands understood more than her eyes. The putty had to be warm enough to yield but cool enough to hold. The knife angle mattered. So did the amount of pressure in the wrist. A good line looked simple, only after the hand had stopped showing off. For the cracked panes she worked more slowly. Some could be replaced without disturbing the whole sash. Others required removing brittle stops and labelling each one in pencil so it returned to its own side. Old wood had opinions. The bottom rail of one sash split when she lifted it, despite care. She sat back, breathed through the first sharp rise of frustration, then glued and clamped it with 2 blocks and a scrap of cloth, leaving it overnight by the hearth. The sash cords were worse than the glass. Several windows had counterweights hidden in side pockets, but the cords had rotted or snapped, leaving sashes heavy and dangerous. Amos supplied 1/4 inch cotton sash cord. explaining that nylon could work but did not belong to these windows. Silas, passing on his way to somewhere else, showed her how to open the pocket without chewing the trim to splinters. Find the screw. I do not see it. Paint sees it. He handed her a small scraper and left before she could ask him to stay. Behind the painted-over access panel, the iron counterweight hung in darkness, detached from its cord but still present. She tied the new cord to a length of wire, fished it over the pulley, and lowered it until the end appeared in the pocket. The first knot failed, sliding when she tested weight. The second, tied too bulky, would not pass cleanly. She opened the manual, then she practiced a figure-8 knot on a scrap until her fingers could tie it without looking. The figure-8 held. She tied it at the counterweight, checked the travel, attached the cord to the sash, and lifted. The window rose with a balanced, almost courteous motion. It stayed where she left it. The pleasure of that nearly made her laugh, but the sound caught in her throat and became only a breath. One by one, the windows returned to use. 3 missing panes filled, 4 cracked panes replaced or stabilized, 1 original pane cleaned but not altered. On the 1008 glass plus the black She used only warm water, a soft rag, and the restraint to stop before perfection. The glass had bubbles, waviness, faint scratches, and a crescent scar near the lower corner. Through it, winter light came bent and old. She left the pencil note beneath the frame untouched. The last window was the western one in the back room, closest to the large railroad landscape. Its sash had swollen, its cord snapped, and its putty failed along the bottom so badly that the pane rattled whenever wind struck the wall. Faye waited until a clear February afternoon when the light fell low and gold along the workbench. She had become less awkward by then, not skilled enough to boast, skilled enough to trust sequence. Score, scrape, lift, clean, prime, bed, set, point, putty, draw, The bevel came clean on the first pass, except for one small drag near the corner. She looked at it, knife still in hand, and chose not to repair it into something worse. Outside, on a walnut branch just beyond the glass, a chickadee landed, so light the branch barely moved. It wore its black cap like a formal decision. The bird turned its head once, looking into the room through the newly set pane. Faye remained still. The chickadee hopped closer along the branch, pecked at something beneath the bark, then fluffed itself against the cold. Behind Faye, the plaster mountain rose in the large layout, its hidden compartment open but empty now, its purpose changed in front of her, the window held. The bird stayed for 7 breaths. Then it flew. Faye set the putty knife on the bench, wiped her hands, and opened the sash 2 inches. Cold air entered, clean and brief, carrying the smell of thawing bark, chimney smoke from somewhere down the road, and the first faint dampness of a February afternoon, considering spring, but not yet trusting it. She closed the window gently. It met the sill without rattle. The plaster began announcing itself after the windows stopped rattling. Not in a single fall, not in a collapse that would have forced attention, but in 3 tired patches near the chimney where the wall had held more damp than it could carry. One patch bulged like a swollen knuckle above the mantel. Another had cracked into a map of narrow islands. The third, lower and darker, released a small crescent of lime dust every time the fire warmed the room, and the wall expanded by its old, almost secret measure. Faye pressed the surface with 2 fingers. It moved. She did not press again. Behind the failed patches lay horsehair plaster on hand-split oak lath, original to an earlier room than the depot itself. When she cut a careful square around the worst section, the loose plaster came away in layers. Finish coat thin and pale, brown coat gritty with sand, scratch coat scored in ridges and threaded with dark hairs that still held in places after more than a century. The lath behind it had been split by hand, not sawn. Its surface ridged enough for plaster to grip. Some strips remained sound. Others near the chimney had loosened where old leaks had worked down year after year. She saved every piece that came away cleanly, laying them on newspaper by size. Not to reuse, necessarily, to study. Amos looked at one fragment beneath the light in his store, and nodded with the wary respect men give old work when it has lasted longer than their own certainty. "Horsehair," he said. "Yes, sir." "Real lime, too." "Not gypsum. I need to patch it without making the wall angry." That almost made him smile. From a shelf behind the counter, he brought down a paper sack tied with twine and coated in the faint dust of many years. The label had been written by his father in 1958, "Clean horsehair, plaster." He set it on the counter as though placing a relic. Dad kept everything, Amos said. Sometimes that was a fault. Sometimes not. She bought a small portion of lime, sand fine enough for finish work, and enough horsehair to repair the 3 patches. Amos made her wear a mask while mixing dry material, and he lent her a hawk, a margin trowel, and a scarifier made from bent nails set into a wood handle. The account took another narrow step upward. She wrote it down that night beside the others, then closed the notebook before the number could become larger than the work. The repair took longer than the size of the wound suggested. First, she secured the loose lath with small cut nails, tapping gently enough not to shake more plaster free. She dampened the edges of existing plaster with a brush, waiting between passes until the old lime stopped drinking water too quickly. The scratch coat came first, a coarse mix of lime, sand, and chopped horsehair, pushed through the gaps between lath so it formed keys behind the strips. She scored the surface with the scarifier while it was still soft, leaving rough grooves for the brown coat. The scratch coat had to stiffen, not dry too fast. She kept the room temperate with a low fire and hung a damp cloth nearby, not touching the patch but lending moisture to the air. Too much heat would crack the lime. Too much cold would sulk it into uselessness. Old materials did not obey impatience, but they did respond to attention. The brown coat went on 3 days later, 3/8 of an inch thick, measured first by eye, and then by a little wood gauge she made from scrap. It had more sand, less hair, and a body that resisted the trowel until her wrist learned the angle. She pressed it flush with the surrounding wall, ruled it level with a straight board, then scratched it lightly for the finish coat. 72 hours cure. Amos had written. She gave it 76 because the nights were colder than the book expected. The finish coat was only 1/8 inch, pale, smooth, and unforgiving. She mixed less than she wanted. A small batch well used was better than a large batch rushed. The trowel had to glide, not scrape. At first her stroke left ridges. She waited, misted, smoothed again. The second patch came better. The third held a surface so clean that she stopped before pride made her touch it once too often. When the lime had set enough to hold its own, the wall looked neither new nor wounded. The patches were visible if one knew where to look. Their colour was slightly lighter, their edges carefully feathered, their truth honest. She stood with one hand against the mantel and looked at them in the late February dusk. These patches will hold another 100 years. The sentence rose without drama and settled there. Not as prophecy, but as a modest agreement between hand and wall. She banked the fire, cleaned the trowel until no lime remained along its edge, and hung the horsehair sack from a peg where mice could not reach it. That night, no powder gathered on the hearth. Doris began by pretending not to begin. The first paper bag appeared on the depot's front step on a morning when sleet had glazed the grass and made the gravel spur shine dark as iron. Faye found it while carrying ash outside. It was folded twice at the top and weighted with a jar. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a small crock of bean soup, and an apple with a bruise near the stem. No note, no name. But the bag smelled faintly of coffee and fryer oil, and on the bottom someone had written speckled hen in blue grease pencil, as if the bag itself had forgotten discretion. Faye carried the jar back to the cafe the next day. Doris Whitmer stood behind the counter, tying an apron around a waist made solid by years of work. Her hair, once red and now more iron than fire, was pinned in a loose knot that let strands escape when steam rose from the soup kettle. She wore no jewellery except a watch with a cracked leather band and a flour mark on one cheek she did not bother wiping away. The cafe was narrow, warm and full of morning sounds, cups set down, spoons stirring, the low murmur of older men discussing roads as though roads were relatives. Faye placed the washed jar on the counter. Doris looked at it, then at her. "Wrong place," Doris said. "It was on my step. Lots of steps in this county. It had your bag. Bags wander." Faye rested both hands on the counter. "I mean to pay," Doris snorted softly. "Not unkindly. In candles when the shop reopens." "The shop is not open." "Then I am patient." The next week, another bag appeared. Then another, never daily. Never enough to make dependents feel organised, sometimes soup, sometimes the ends of loaves. Once a wedge of molasses pie wrapped in parchment with the burnt edge cut off. Though Faye would have eaten the edge gladly, Doris refused every attempt at accounting. She would take empty jars and paper bags back only if they were clean, and she corrected Faye once for scrubbing the label off a lid. That lid knew where it belonged. After that, Faye washed more carefully. Doris did not ask about the money, the depot's interior, or the reason a girl with winter hands had taken on a building everyone else had left. She asked whether the chimney still smoked, whether the windows held putty, whether Amos was overcharging for nails, and whether Faye had enough salt. These questions were more intimate than autobiography. They dealt with living. Caleb arrived in the second week of March, though his name had begun reaching the depot before he did. She had seen him twice on a black Schwinn bicycle, pedalling past the gravel spur with a splitting maul lashed across the back rack and a school backpack bouncing between his shoulders. He was about 16, narrow in the wrists, broadening awkwardly in the way of boys whose bones had received instructions faster than their balance. His hair was brown and cut too short on one side. His jeans were patched at both knees with darker denim. He looked at the depot each time he passed, but did not stop until the morning. Faye tried splitting walnut deadfall with an axe head that had loosened on the handle. He braked at the lane and watched 3 poor swings in silence. Then he said, "That handle's near done." Faye lowered the axe. "Yes. You got wedges." "No. You got sense not to swing it." "Some." He leaned the bicycle against the walnut tree, untied the maul, and split the first round with one clean fall of the head. The sound cracked through the yard and startled a crow from the roofline. Caleb did not grin after doing it. That restraint made her trust him more than showing off would have. "I cannot pay you," she said. "My mother said." "Your mother said what?" He set another round upright. "About your grandfather." The word struck the yard strangely. He must have meant Walter. Or he meant the old stories had already rearranged the family line in town, making all careful men into grandfathers because that was easier than explaining loss. What did she say? That he fixed her Christmas train when she was little. Would not take money. Said trains should run at Christmas. Caleb swung again. The walnut split into 2 clean halves. "I do not know if that was my grandfather. My mother says people who fix trains count. He worked 2 hours and accepted only water." When Faye tried to hand him a coin from the small tobacco tin, not one of the old coins but a modern quarter found beneath the counter, he stepped back as though it were hot. "No, it is work." My mother said no. "Your mother is strict, mostly tired." He returned the next Saturday, and then when school and weather allowed, he stacked wood with ends facing east because he said morning sun helped. He showed her how to read checks in a log, where to place them all, and why frozen wood split cleaner than wet. In exchange, though no agreement was spoken, she let him look at the large layout from the doorway. He never touched without asking. When she finally allowed him to hold the brass track gauge, he accepted it with both hands. Reverend Boyd was the simplest and the hardest to understand. He passed the depot every morning at nearly the same hour, walking from a white parsonage near the edge of town toward the church whose steeple Faye could see when leaves were down. He was tall and spare, with a black coat brushed at the cuffs, a scarf wrapped twice around his neck, and a hat he lifted to every person, animal, and passing delivery truck as if manners were not dependent on category. His hair was silver, his face long, and his eyes set deep beneath brows that gave him a severe look until he smiled. He did not come in. He did not ask whether she had been saved, which spared him from becoming unwelcome. The first time he paused at the lane, he tipped his hat and said, "Morning, Miss Whitcomb." Then he walked on. The next morning, the same. By the 5th morning, he added 4 words while passing the milk can at the turn. "Lord, keep her steady." He said them without performance, without stopping, without making her receive them as conversation. The words went into the cold air and remained there after he had walked beyond the culvert. Faye stood by the woodpile with bark dust on her sleeve, listening to his steps diminish. After that, he prayed in passing every morning. Some days the prayer changed, but it remained 4 words. Give her enough light. Let the roof hold. Bless this careful work. Keep smoke drawing clean. When she saw him in town outside the post office, he did not trap her with piety. He tipped his hat as always and asked whether the road was too muddy near the spur. She told him the culvert was holding. He nodded, as if culverts were part of pastoral care. These 3 did not gather around her, they did not form a circle and call it rescue. Doris left bags and argued about jars. Caleb split wood and rode away before thanks grew heavy. Reverend Boyd walked past with 4 words for the air. Their help had edges. Their help allowed her to remain standing inside her own life. One afternoon, while patching a small nick in the plaster near the front window, Faye heard Caleb outside stacking wood in uneven rhythm. heard Doris's cafe bell far off when wind came right, and saw Reverend Boyd's dark coat passing at the road. The depot held those separate motions without claiming them. It had been waiting, and so had she. She pressed the last bit of lime smooth with the corner of the trowel and let it be. The cellar had waited longer than everything else because downward places ask a different courage. Faye postponed it through roof days, chimney days, floor days, window days, plaster days. She told herself the reasons were practical, and most of them were. The roof had been urgent, the chimney dangerous, the floors necessary, the windows open to weather, the plaster failing near heat. A cellar beneath an abandoned workshop could hold rot, snakes, mould, standing water, broken jars, bad air, or nothing at all. Nothing could wait. On February 11th, after 3 clear cold days and one night when the fire held coals until morning, she decided the waiting had become avoidance. The cellar door was in the back room, hidden beneath a scarred plywood panel near the storage closet. She had noticed the pull ring weeks earlier but had stacked boxes over it until she was ready to pretend she had forgotten. That morning she moved the boxes, swept the panel and checked the hinges. They had rust but not ruin. She tied a rope around the ring, stood to one side and pulled. The panel lifted with a groan of old wood swollen against old dust. Air came up from below, cool, mineral, and still. She waited 10 minutes with the door open. Amos had warned her about bad air in closed spaces, though he had admitted most cellars were less dramatic than fear made them. She lit a candle and lowered it in a bucket tied to twine. The flame stayed upright. She lowered it farther, still upright. Only then did she take the lantern, the broom handle, and the first step. There were 7 granite steps down, each one worn at the centre and damp along the edges. The walls were fieldstone, close-fitted without ornament, and the floor below measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. Unlike the lean-to, it had not failed. The cellar held cold the way a jar holds water. On one wall stood empty shelves made from thick planks. On another, hooks for tools long gone. A rusted canning rack lay on its side near the far corner. There were mouse bones beneath one shelf, a broken crock, and the remains of a burlap sack stiffened by age. At the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the rougher stones around it. Its surface had been smoothed by a mason's hand, and near one corner was carved a small craft mark, a circle crossed by a fine line, with 3 short rays rising from the top like a sunrise over rail. Not deep, not decorative, deliberate. Faye crouched beside it and brushed dust away with her sleeve. The slab did not shift under pressure. It looked as if it might be meant to lift, but the thought of lifting it alone was foolishness, and something in its placement asked not for disturbance, but memory. She traced the mark once in the air above it, not touching. Then she stood. Not everything hidden was ready to be opened. She cleaned the cellar in sections, carrying debris up one bucket at a time. The stone floor emerged under dirt, uneven but sound. She found 2 intact blue glass jars, a broken lantern globe, and a bundle of rotted cord. Nothing of value. Enough of use. By afternoon, the place had become less ominous and more like a lung that had finally drawn air. It was on the stairs going up that she saw the small oak box. It had been wedged under the 3rd step from the bottom, not fully hidden, but shadowed by the overhang and darkened to the colour of the stair itself. Her boot brushed it, and it shifted half an inch with a dry wooden sound. She stopped, set the lantern on the step above, knelt. The box was no longer than her hand, made from oak with tiny dovetails at the corners and a sliding lid swollen by years. She worked it loose carefully, carried it upstairs, and opened it on the workbench with the same patience she had given the cedar disc beneath the mountain. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow was not round. It had been shaped like the craft mark from the granite slab, a circle, a fine crossing line, 3 short rays. The shaft was narrow, darkened near the teeth, and worn enough to prove use. Beneath it lay a tintype photograph wrapped in tissue that had browned at the folds. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of the depot before it was the depot, or before the sign, or before time had chosen which name the building would carry. The clapboard behind her was fresh enough to show separate brush strokes. The front step was clean. Walnut trees rose smaller in the background. The woman wore a long skirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and an apron marked with pale dust. In one hand she held a small carving tool, in the other a miniature station platform no wider than a book. Faye brought the photograph closer to the window. The woman's face looked back at her. Not perfectly. Time does not repeat with a ruler. But the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth, the narrow chin, the serious brow that made softness difficult to see at first glance, all stood near enough to make Faye lower the photograph and look away. On the back, written in dark ink, Lydia Ann Whitcomb, daughter of Josiah Whitcomb, age 25, summer of 1909. The date did not match the earliest note on the window. Did not need to. Histories overlapped in old buildings the way paint layers did. Someone had stood where Faye now stood. Someone with her face, holding a tool of the trade. Before the world had decided what parts of her labour to record, she placed the tintype beside Eleanor's letter, then carried the brass key to the mantel. She set it on the mantel where the firelight touched the shaped bow. For now, it could wait. Spring did not arrive as a change of scenery. It arrived as water. Snow withdrew from the north side of the depot in stubborn patches, shrinking day by day until only grey crust remained beneath the sumac. The creek grew louder with snowmelt, pushing brown and cold beneath the stone culvert, carrying twigs, last year's leaves, and once the bright red cap from a bottle Faye had not seen anyone drop. Mud took the gravel spur and held the print of every boot, wheel, and animal crossing. The walnut trees put out catkins, green gold and strange against the dark limbs, and the air began smelling less of smoke and more of thawed earth. Faye opened windows on mild afternoons and let the rooms exchange their winter breath for something moving. The depot did not become easy. Its lean-to still needed judgment. The south wall still required bracing more permanent than winter measures. The account at Amos's store remained a number she respected by not ignoring it. There were still mice, there was still no running water. Rain could still find one place near the rear sill where it darkened the board if wind came hard from the east. But the roof shed, the chimney drew, the floor held, the windows rose on cotton cord and stayed where she placed them. Plaster patches dried pale and true wood stacked by Caleb's hand seasoned under a scrap of tin. Doris's jars moved back and forth between cafe and depot in a rhythm neither woman named. Reverend Boyd continued past each morning, though his prayers changed when the weather softened. Let spring come gently. Faye had thought during the coldest weeks that once she could stand in a dry room with fire, repaired glass, and tools returned to their drawers, she would begin the craft at once. The desire had carried her through many tasks. She had imagined mixing plaster, carving rock, twisting tree armatures, laying track, soldering lamps, until the station windows glowed again. She had imagined proving herself to the room. Yet when April light finally came through the western pane and touched the large layout, she did not reach for plaster. Not this spring. The decision settled slowly and without shame. The work deserved a hand that was rested enough to learn, not merely desperate enough to begin. She would order materials later with 1 coin from the tobacco tin, 1 ordinary silver quarter whose spending would be recorded and honoured, not squandered. She would practice first on small samples, 1 hill, 1 culvert, 1 brick wall, 1 tree line, 1 lamp circuit laid open where errors could teach without being buried beneath scenery. She would copy Eleanor's ratios on cards and test them in weather, noting cure times, colour shifts, failures, cracks and corrections. The craft had crossed generations by being exact. She would not receive it by rushing. On the first warm evening of April, she carried a chair outside and sat near the walnut with the horseshoe grown into it. The brass key remained on the mantel inside. The tintype rested wrapped in tissue beside the letter. The depot behind her held its repaired windows in the reddening light, each pane reflecting a different piece of sky. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, the first completed piece stood beneath the magnifying lamp on the restored workbench, no larger than a loaf of bread and 12 times more demanding. It was not a train, not yet, not a grand layout, not a mountain, not a town meant to make visitors lean close and forget their coats. It was a single winter culvert in miniature, built from carved plaster stones, each block washed with grey, umber, and the faint green of damp moss. A narrow creek passed under it, resin poured in 2 1/8-inch layers, dark beneath the arch and clearer where it broke over 3 stones. On one bank grew wire-twisted saplings, not healthy, not symmetrical, their trunks wrapped, painted, brushed, and dusted until they looked as if wind had spent years teaching them humility. Along the road above, a trace of cinder had been worked into the snow-muddied edge. A person passing quickly might have called it simple. Faye knew every correction hidden inside it. The first resin pour had clouded because the cellar was too cold. She had written that down. The first stone wash had dried purple under lamplight. She had written that down too. The first tree armature looked like a hand, so she unwound it and began again. The creek bank collapsed when she added too much glue. The plaster cured too quickly one afternoon when the fire was high. A lamp wire broke under the roadbed because she bent it twice in the same place. Failure had become less like judgment and more like instruction. The completed culvert held one light hidden beneath the arch, so faint it could be seen only when the room was dark. She wired it openly first, tested the lamp, marked both leads, soldered the joint by heating the wire rather than the solder, and only then concealed it beneath the road. When she connected the battery and the small amber glow appeared under the arch, she did not speak. She sat back and watched the miniature water receive light. The depot around her had changed without becoming polished. The front room now held a scrubbed counter, shelves repaired and painted in a soft cream mixed from leftover paint. Amos found in his storage room, and a small card rack Caleb had rebuilt from the broken original. The old cash register remained still without a drawer, cleaned and left as an object of memory rather than commerce. Behind the counter, jars of scenery powder stood labelled in Faye's hand, some from old stock, some from new mixtures tested and dated. The floor had darkened with use after oil, warm honey where feet crossed most often, deeper near the hearth. The back room remained a workshop, not a display. Tools hung on pegboard within penciled outlines she had redrawn from the old shadows. Walter's Bible rested on a shelf beside Eleanor's letter, both wrapped now in cloth when not being read. The zinc box sat inside a locked cupboard. Amos had helped her build from salvaged poplar, though the money inside remained almost untouched. The large railroad layout had not been restored all at once. That would have been disrespectful. She repaired only the trestle, stabilized the mountain opening, cleaned one station platform and rewired 3 lamps, so that at dusk a narrow line of windows could glow across the abandoned miniature town. There was a new stovepipe properly fitted, a washstand with a basin, 2 chairs, a cot in the storage room made less severe by a quilt. Doris insisted was too worn for cafe raffles but too good for a rag bin. The lean-to had been braced, cleaned and roofed in spring of 2024 with Caleb's help and Silas's supervision from a chair, his knees having become more selective than ever. The south wall no longer leaned farther. It had been jacked slowly over many days, braced from inside, and tied with lumber that would never appear in photographs but would keep the building honest. Nothing glittered. Everything worked. The brass key did not reveal itself until after the second hard frost of that December, when a storm tore one of the lower walnut limbs and left it hanging over the creek. Split at the trunk but not fallen, Faye noticed the break while carrying ash outside. The tree nearest the culvert, the one with the horseshoe grown into bark, had opened slightly along an old seam below the iron. She fetched Caleb because trees could be more dangerous after storms than roofs. He came with a saw, work gloves and the same Schwinn bicycle, though he had grown taller and now rode with the awkward machine beneath him as if childhood had not yet been informed of its dismissal. Together they cleared the broken limb in sections, lowering each with rope so it would not tear more bark. When the weight was gone, Faye saw a thin line of brass set into the trunk behind a fold of old growth. Not bright brass. Darkened. Hidden. Almost swallowed. The line formed the edge of a plate no wider than a playing card. Bark had grown around it, but not over the keyhole at its centre. The keyhole was shaped like a narrow stem beneath a circle. Faye went inside without speaking and brought the brass key from the mantel, where it had waited through 2 winters and a long education in not forcing answers. The key entered cleanly. It turned with one careful pressure. Behind the plate, a small compartment opened in the living wood, lined with tin and sealed long ago against weather with wax and pitch. Caleb stood back at once, as though the tree itself had become a room, and he had not been invited past the threshold. Faye reached inside and removed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The oilcloth held a folded 48-star American flag, small enough to have been carried rather than flown from a public pole. Its fabric smelled of cedar, metal, and the dry sweetness of age. Tucked inside the first fold was a note, written in ink-faded brown but legible. August 12th, 1945, My Eleanor. If this reaches your hands, it means Peter's flag has come home by a road he did not. I could not bear to give it to the courthouse case, nor let it lie in a drawer where grief goes blind. I have placed it in the walnut because roots know how to hold what hands cannot. The radio says the war may be near ending. I do not know what to do with near. Near is not home. Near is not his boots by the door. Near is not David asking why his father's chair stays empty. Keep the flag until someone can unfold it without breaking. Not today. Not soon. Someday. Mother, Lydia Ann Whitcomb. Faye read the note twice beside the tree, then folded it along the old lines with the same care she had given Eleanor's pages. Caleb took off his cap. He did not seem to know he had done it. The winter air moved through the walnut branches, and the horseshoe higher in the bark held its dark curve above them. Inside the depot, she cleared the workbench and laid the flag flat on clean muslin. 48 stars arranged in straight rows, the blue field darkened but intact. She did not unfold it fully until her hands were warm and dry. The cloth had weak places along 2 folds, so she supported them with paper beneath and did not let the weight pull. The note from Lydia she placed beside the tintype photograph of the young woman with Faye's face, the tool of the trade in her hand, the depot fresh behind her. The key returned to the mantel by evening. It had done its work. The medal was carried to the cemetery the following Memorial Day, May 27th, 2024. Because public dates matter when private grief has been hidden too long. The real cemetery lay outside Strasburg, where older stones leaned under cedar trees and newer military markers stood in lines of clean granite. Reverend Boyd helped her locate Peter Albright Whitcomb's name in the records. The body itself rested overseas, he explained, but a memorial stone had been placed there after the war by family who needed somewhere to stand. Faye brought the medal in its case, not to leave it to weather, but to let it be present where the name had waited. She cleaned the stone with water and a soft brush. No harsh scraping. No chemicals. No improvement that harmed what remained. Doris came with a small jar of coffee because mornings in cemeteries were still mornings. Amos came late and stood at the back, hat in hand. Caleb, taller by then and quieter in a new way, placed a sprig of walnut leaves beside the stone. Reverend Boyd said only a short prayer, and for once it was not 4 words. Even so, he kept it spare. The medal returned to the depot before noon. Honour did not require display forever. As for the money, stories would have made a great show of it. This one cannot. Faye spent 3 coins from the tobacco tin and no more. 1 ordinary silver quarter was exchanged through a patient coin dealer Amos trusted to buy fresh plaster, mica and fine wire for the first practice pieces. One worn wheat penny, after being valued and recorded, paid for archival sleeves for the letters and photographs, though Amos argued she could have let him add the sleeves to account. One buffalo nickel, nearly smooth, purchased the small brass plaque that now sat inside the depot, not on the front door, not outside for tourists, but beneath the workbench where only someone sweeping properly would notice it. It read, "Repair what can still hold." The bills remained in the zinc box, the stock certificates, after advice from a bank officer in Lancaster, and a lawyer who charged less than he could have, because Mrs. Hirschberger had called him before Faye arrived, proved complicated. Some were only paper witnesses. Some carried modest value through successor companies and forgotten transfers. None of it became a spectacle. Enough was converted to clear Amos's account, pay back taxes, secure insurance, connect electricity safely, and repair what weather would not forgive. The rest went into a trust with a plain instruction written in Faye's own hand. For the next one. Not a legal phrase by itself, the lawyer warned. Then help me make it legal. He did. No extravagant spending followed, no car with a ribbon, no new wardrobe beyond boots that did not leak, and a coat warm enough to let her work without shivering. She bought good blades, safe wiring, lumber when salvage would be false economy, and food before hunger made decisions smaller. The depot did not become a monument to discovery. It became a place where money had done its best work by disappearing into stability. The shop reopened by index card. Doris pinned it to the cafe corkboard between a notice for piano lessons and a lost cat with one ear clipped. Miniature Depot Workshop. Repairs. Small landscapes. Custom rail scenes. Slow work. Honest estimates. Inquire by mail or leave note at Speckled Hen. No phone number at first. No website. No grand reopening. The first request came from a retired brakeman in bird in hand who had a cracked model caboose his granddaughter had stepped on and then cried over for 2 days. Faye repaired the ladder, matched the paint poorly twice and properly the third time, and charged $7 because the man insisted that free work made him feel pitied. The second request came from a schoolteacher with a box of old farm figures missing bases. The third, from a widow whose husband had begun a model of their first house and died before adding the porch. By the end of that winter there was a mailing list of 43 names written in a ledger Amos gave her when his store changed inventory systems. Some people wanted repairs. Some wanted to see whether the old place truly had a light in the window again. Some never ordered anything and only mailed notes about fathers, trains, barns, stations, or the smell of coal smoke in childhood. Faye answered slowly. She did not use language larger than the work. Yes, I can repair the railing. No, I cannot promise by Christmas. Please send a photograph of the porch. I will need to see how the roofline meets the L. One woman from Ohio sent a check too large for a platform repair. Faye returned the difference in cash wrapped around a note. The woman wrote back on blue stationery. My mother said honest work would find honest work. I'm glad she was right at least once. The sign arrived in April, carried under Caleb's arm while rain freckled the road and made his hair lie flat against his forehead. He was 17 then. Nearly grown but still arriving by bicycle because he said the Schwinn understood the lane better than any borrowed truck. The sign was wrapped in a feed sack tied with baling twine. He stood in the front room dripping on the mat while Faye cleared space on the counter. My shop teacher said the letters are uneven, he said. Are they? He said that before he saw the old sign. Together they unwrapped it. The board was walnut. Not large, planned smooth but with one live edge left along the bottom. The letters were hand-carved and painted cream, with a fine green shadow behind each stroke. They read, Whitcomb Daughters, Miniature Depot Workshop. Faye stood so long without touching it that Caleb began explaining too quickly. I know it is plural. I know there is not anyone else. I just thought, because Lydia and Eleanor and maybe your people before, and because if it said daughter singular, it sounded like it ended with you, but daughters means it keeps going, not like children necessarily, Just hands, women's hands, careful ones. He stopped, embarrassed by having said so much. Rain tapped at the repaired windows. Faye touched the carved ampersand first. Caleb had made it shaped almost like the craft mark, a curve crossing itself, not exact, but close enough to show he had looked with attention. The letters were uneven. The spacing between T and E in daughters widened slightly. The final S sat lower than the rest. It was unmistakably handmade. It was right. "Where should it hang?" he asked. "Inside," she said. "Not out front." "Not yet." He nodded, relieved perhaps that the weather would not get at his work. They hung it above the back workbench, where the old pegboard shadows had once shown tools missing. Caleb held the board while Faye marked the holes. She drilled pilot holes, set screws, checked level, then stepped back. Whitcomb daughters. Plural, not fame. Not announcement. More like a door left unlatched for anyone careful enough to notice. That evening, after Caleb rode home and Doris's jar had been washed for return, Faye took out a clean stack of paper from the drawer marked letterhead, though there was no letterhead on it yet. She set Eleanor's letter to the left, Walter's Bible to the right, and the tintype of Lydia above both, weighted with the brass key so it would not curl. Then she began writing her own letter. She did not know who would read it. She did not know whether blood would matter by then, or whether the next careful hands would belong to a person with no name connected to hers at all. That uncertainty no longer frightened her, as it once might have. The work had reached her by a path no one could have mapped, a forgotten notice, a clerk's memory, a hardware ledger, a cafe bag, a boy's maul, a reverend's 4 words, an old woman's letter hidden inside a plaster mountain. She dipped the pen, though ballpoints would have been easier, because ink slowed the hand. The first line had already been given. "My dear one, whoever you are." She paused after writing it and listened. The depot answered in its winter manner, stove settling, wood contracting, a faint tick from the cooling chimney outside, water under the culvert. In the large layout, 3 repaired lamps shone along the miniature platform, where a tiny painted woman still sat on a bench with hands folded in her lap. Faye had not repainted that figure. She had only dusted it with a soft brush and set it upright again. The letter continued. She wrote of the roof and the chimney, because affection without facts was only decoration. She wrote where the account books were kept, which joist had been replaced, which window held salvaged glass, which key opened the cupboard, and which drawer contained cedar shims. She wrote that money should buy time, not admiration. She wrote that hunger could make a person ashamed of receiving, and that shame should be set down before it damaged the gift. She wrote Walter's sentence too. "These do not make the hand careful. They reveal whether it already is." Then she added her own line below it. "A careful hand is not born. It is allowed to remain." The sentence looked plain on paper. Plain was best. Near midnight she folded nothing. The ink needed drying. She left the pages open on the bench with a clean mug weighted beside them so a draught would not turn them. Before sleeping, she walked once through both rooms, checking the stove, the window latches, the cupboard, the front wedge she still used from habit, though the door had a proper lock now, and the large model table where the plaster mountain had kept its secret through decades of weather and neglect. At the threshold between rooms, she stopped. It had been waiting, and so had she. She said it aloud only once, softly enough that it belonged to the house more than to the night. Years would change the place again. Dust would gather despite sweeping. New repairs would become old repairs. Some person might one day stand at the counter with cold hands and a satchel, trying not to look hungry. Some other careful child might lean over the workbench and learn that a creek is darker under the bank, that solder flows toward heat, that plaster must be carved while it is neither wet nor hard, that nothing in nature stands at attention for long. Faye would not be able to arrange all of that. No one arranges inheritance completely. One can only leave the latch findable, the tools clean, the warnings honest, and enough warmth for the next person to remain through the first night. Outside, Snow began again, fine and slow, silvering the gravel spur, the walnut roots, the stone culvert, the milk can rusted into its watch at the road. It softened the roof Caleb had helped maintain, gathered on the sign that still hung outside with its faded old letters, and touched the creek before vanishing into water. Inside, the new walnut sign kept its place above the bench. Whitcomb's Daughters. The miniature depot waits. It has always waited. In Mrs. Hirschberger's desk, in the top drawer beneath receipt books, paper clips, and 2 peppermint candies gone soft with age, the 3 worn dollar bills remained folded together with the original purchase receipt. The clerk had retired that spring and left the drawer to her successor with a note written in her square, official hand. Do not deposit these. No one had.